He was hit by a car on Tremont Street. Headphones, a honk, a crash, darkness, and he woke up in a stranger's body in a strange world, face down in cold mud next to a dead man. And the first thing he realized was this: here he could hear everything, every note of the wind, every rattle in strangers' lungs, every spell down to the last overtone. And in a world where magic is sound, perfect hearing is either a gift or a weapon. Ian spits out the mud and rolls onto his back. The sky isn't the same. Not reddish from the streetlights, but black, strewn with unfamiliar stars. There's a stench nearby. He turns his head and sees a dead man. A man in his 40s lies on his side with a lute by his side. An arrow with gray feathers sticks out of his throat. Blood has congealed into a dark crust on his collar. Ian presses his back against the wall of the ditch. His heart is pounding, but he hears more than just his heart. He hears everything. The wind in the bushes hums a pure D. The grass rustles at a frequency that could be plotted on a spectrogram. Every sound here has a precise pitch, as if the world were tuned to a tuning fork. It's impossible. It's beautiful. It's terrifying. Voices ring out from above. Two men approach the edge of the ditch and look down. They're speaking a language Ian doesn't know. Not a single familiar word. But he reads their intonations like musical notes. The one on the left speaks rapidly and stumbles over his consonants. Fear. Lies. He reassures his partner, but doesn't believe a word of it himself. The one on the right replies in a low, hoarse voice. A dry rasp creaks in his throat with every exhale. A lung disease this man doesn't yet know he has. Silver badges shaped like small forks gleam on both their collars. Tuning forks. The one on the left is growing increasingly nervous. He looks around. He whispers 3 syllables. The first vowel is a pure A. The second adds an overtone a fifth higher. The third closes the phrase with a sibilant sound like a sustain pedal. A small flame flares up above his palm. Small, red-haired, alive. Ian stops breathing. He has just heard the entire spell, every overtone, every pause, every microtone between the syllables. And before his brain has time to say no, his lips move on their own. 3 syllables, pure A, a fifth, a sibilant. A small flame flares up in his palm. Brighter than the mage's. Pure, with a golden hue instead of red. Both mages fall silent. The one on the left takes a step back. The one on the right stops wheezing and stares down at his hand. Now imagine this moment. A dirty kid in a ditch next to a corpse is holding in his palm a flame that magicians spend decades learning to control. The silence stretches on for 5 seconds. And then Ian does the only thing that comes to mind. He looks at the dead musician, at the lute, at the mages, and slowly utters words in their language that he somehow knows. This was his teacher. His teacher died in his arms. Can he take the instrument? He doesn't understand where the words came from. The language is foreign, but his mouth pronounces the sounds confidently, as if he'd been doing it for years. Maybe the body remembers. Maybe the world works differently. The mages exchange glances. The one on the right nods. A dead vagrant and his student aren't worth their time. They walk away. Ian is left alone with the lute's corpse and a tiny flame in his palm. He clenches his fist and the flame goes out. His fingers tremble. The last thing he remembers is Tremont Street and the blow. And now he's here, in a body that moves like his own but lies in a ditch next to a dead man, in a world where people light fires with their voices. Ian picks up the lute. The neck is thinner than a guitar's, 4 strings. He plucks the top one and it rings out a pure G without a single impurity. The body resonates so deeply that the vibration reverberates in his ribs. Ian stands up. His legs feel unsteady. His head is spinning. But his hearing is sharper than ever. He hears an owl 300 meters away. He hears the stream behind the hill rolling over the rocks in F-sharp minor. He hears someone far to the east is drawing out a low, guttural note that drifts beyond the horizon and fades away. This world sounds like an orchestra before a concert. Each instrument is being tuned separately, and together they hum so deeply that an ordinary person would mistake it for silence. But Ian is no ordinary person. He's a sound engineer, and this mix is raw and needs work. He heads east. The lute hangs behind his back on a dead man's strap. By dawn, he reaches a village, a dozen houses, a well, a tavern with a crooked sign. He can't read the letters, but he hears chairs being moved inside and a fire being stoked in the stove. Ian walks in. It's warm inside and smells of bread. A plump woman behind the counter asks him something. He doesn't understand the words, but the tone is clear. What do you want, and do you have any money? Ian dumps a handful of the dead man's coins onto the counter. The woman nods and points to a table by the wall. They bring him porridge and a mug of something hot. Ian eats and listens. Every person in the tavern is an instrument. The old man by the window wheezes as he exhales. His bronchial tubes are clogged. 2 years at most if left untreated. The boy by the door sniffs with a clear, high-pitched sound. A cold. It'll pass. The landlady breathes evenly and deeply. She's healthy. Strong diaphragm. Maybe she sang in her youth. Ian finishes his meal and closes his eyes. He needs to figure out 3 things: where he is, how to survive, and why this world sounds as if every atom has its own note. The answers come over the course of a few days. He's in no hurry. He sits in the tavern. He listens to the conversations. The language sinks in faster than it should. After 2 days, he understands simple phrases. After 4, he speaks. Not fluently, but well enough. The world is called Kaelion. Magic here is sound. Every spell is a precise sonic structure. Vowels define the form. Consonants set the boundaries. Overtones determine the power. Mages study for decades to pronounce a single spell correctly. Schools differ not by element but by accent. The northern clans sing with their throats. The southern hermits click their tongues. The sea peoples resonate with underwater vibrations. And the Venreath Academy in the capital masters pure speech, the 12 basic harmonics upon which all official magic is based. And there's one more detail that sends shivers down your spine. There's someone wandering the world known as the Silent One. A mage who makes not a sound, yet with a single gesture robs an entire village of its hearing. Wherever he passes, children are born deaf. Bards stop singing. Mages lose their power. People whisper about this. Ian listens and takes it all in. On the 5th day, his coins run out. He needs to earn some money. He's a wandering musician, so he plays. Ian sits down on the tavern porch and picks up his lute. His fingers rest uncertainly on the neck. It's not a violin. A different hand position, a different angle of attack. But strings are strings and notes are notes. He starts with a scale, C major, D minor. Then he plays the melody the boy was humming by the well that morning, a simple 6-note theme. Ian adds a second line, a third. His fingers get used to it. An hour later, he's playing as if he'd been holding this lute for years. Not because he's a genius, because he hears every vibration of every string and moves his fingers in real time. The note doesn't sound right. Shift it by a millimeter. Now that's clean. A crowd gathers around the porch. People are listening. Someone smiles. The landlady brings him some bread and cheese. A coin clinks. Ian plays until evening and earns enough for a place to sleep and dinner. Before going to sleep, he lies on the hard bed and stares at the ceiling, a tiny flame in the palm of his hand. He repeats those 3 syllables in a whisper. The flame flares up, dim, small, but real. He shifts the second overtone up a quarter tone. The flame turns blue. Another shift. It turns green. One more. The flame hisses and burns his skin. Ian extinguishes it and looks at the red spot on his palm. A quarter tone error. The difference between light and a burn. Lesson learned. Precision in this world isn't just a professional requirement. Precision is a matter of life and death. On the 7th day, Ian reached a larger town. It was called Kernville. Stone walls, a market square, 2 taverns, a blacksmith shop, and something like a magical academy with a turret from which the students' harmonious singing could be heard in the mornings. Ian stopped at the gate and listened. A 12-voice choir was singing an exercise, the basic harmonics of pure speech. He could hear each voice distinctly. 3 sang in tune, 4 were acceptable, 5 were so off-key that it made Ian's teeth grind. But among this choir was one voice that didn't just hit the note, it hit the overtone, the microtone, the subtlest overtone between notes that the other 12 couldn't even distinguish. A woman's voice, young, angry. She sang more accurately than anyone else and was angry at those who sang incorrectly. Ian smiled and walked on. He needed a larger tavern. He found it in the square. It was called something like the Copper Bell. It was crowded inside. Evening. Merchants, mercenaries, travelers, and in the corner sat a group of 4 people in heavy cloaks. Northerners. Ian could tell by their breathing. They breathed deeply and slowly. Their diaphragms were as well developed as those of opera singers. Throat singing required lungs like that. One of them was drunk, a burly, bearded man with a red face and a booming voice. He was bragging to the innkeeper, saying that his family had possessed a battle spell for 6 generations, and that his great-grandfather had used that spell to uproot trees. The innkeeper nodded politely and poured him more beer. The bearded man decided to demonstrate. He cleared his throat, took a deep breath, and let out a guttural roar on the note G sharp, with a buzzing overtone an octave higher. The mug on the table trembled. It jumped, and began to dance across the tabletop in small jerks. The tavern burst into laughter and applause. The bearded man beamed. Ian sat 3 tables away and listened. G sharp, an overtone an octave higher. But not just any overtone. There was another layer, a quiet undertone at a frequency the bearded man himself couldn't hear. He produced it by accident. The muscle memory of his throat had been passed down through 6 generations, and no one in his family knew that the true power of the spell lay not in the roar, but in this hidden undertone. Ian reached for his lute, the 3rd string. He quietly turned the tuning peg. G sharp. He checked the overtone. There it was. Now the undertone. He pressed the string at the 4th fret and shifted his finger slightly. A quarter tone lower. There it was. The hidden layer. Ian ran his pick along the string, quietly, almost inaudible amid the tavern's din. The bearded man's mug jumped higher than it had from his roar, and with it, his hat jumped too, right off his head. It soared half a meter and hung in the air for a second before falling back down. The bearded man froze, his mouth agape. The tavern fell silent. Everyone was staring at the hat. Ian took his hand off the string and picked up his mug of ale. He took a sip. The bearded man slowly turned toward him. His eyes were as wide as saucers. Ian smiled sheepishly. He said he apologized to the master, that he'd just been listening very intently, and that it had been a beautiful note. The bearded man was silent for 3 seconds. Then he burst out laughing so hard that the windows rattled. He stood up, strode over to Ian's table, and slapped him on the back so hard it nearly knocked the wind out of him. He said the young man was bold and that such boldness deserved a beer. Then he ordered a mug for him, sat down next to him, and began asking questions. Ian told his story. A wandering musician, his teacher had died. He was going wherever his eyes took him. The bearded man nodded and drank. His name was Torvald. He was a mercenary from the northern class of Gronhammer and was heading south on a contract, guarding a caravan. Torvald asked if the young man knew how to play anything from the north. Ian said no, but he could try if Torvald sang. Torvald began to sing. A low, drawn-out melody, throat singing with a double overtone. A sad song about winter and a lost home. Ian listened. He broke it down. The fundamental tone, the first overtone, the second overtone, the rhythm of breathing, the pauses between phrases. After a minute, he began to play along. Quietly at first, 1 line, then a second, then a third. The lute sang with a voice it wasn't supposed to have. It sounded like the throat of a northerner, like the wind in the mountains, like the creaking of ice beneath one's feet. Torvald stopped singing and stared at the lute, then at Ian, then back at the lute. The tavern listened in silence. Ian played the last phrase and set the instrument. Torvald was silent for a long time. Then he said that in 40 years of life, he had never heard strings sing with a throat, and that if the boy wanted to, he could travel with the caravan to Venreath, for free, in exchange for the music. Ian agreed. It was his first stroke of luck in this world, but not the last, because in the corner of the tavern sat a girl who wasn't laughing with the others. She was sitting at a small table by the wall. In front of her lay a stack of papers and an inkwell. Round glasses perched on her nose. Her dark hair was pulled back into a casual bun. She kept her eyes fixed on Ian, not on the lute, not on Torvald, at his fingers. She saw how he adjusted the peg by a quarter tone. She heard the difference between his note and Torvald's. She understood what had happened. When the tavern quieted down and Torvald went back to his people, the girl stood up and walked over to Ian's table. She sat down across from him and set her glasses on the table. Her eyes were gray and very attentive. She said her name was Sora Lindqvist, that she was a former student of the Venreath Academy, and that what he had just done was impossible. Ian asked what exactly she meant. Sora replied calmly and precisely. She said that he had reproduced a throat spell of the Northern School on a stringed instrument, that no mage in the history of Kalian had ever transferred vocal magic to strings, that everyone believed magic lived only in the living throat, and that she herself had been expelled from the academy because she heard layers in magic that, according to the professors, did not exist. She paused. Then she said that these layers did exist, and that Ian had just proven it. Ian remained silent. He was thinking fast. This girl had heard too much. She was dangerous. Or perhaps she was the only person in this world who could understand him. He decided to take a chance. He said his name was Ian Mercer, that his teacher was indeed dead, and that he was indeed a wandering musician, but that he had a sense of hearing that didn't work like everyone else's. He didn't explain about Boston. He didn't mention the other world. He simply said that he heard more than he should. Sora nodded. She said she knew that feeling. All her life, people had told her she heard things she shouldn't, that her hearing was a defect, that a normal mage couldn't distinguish quarter tones between canonical notes. She took off her glasses and wiped them with the edge of her sleeve. Then she said she wanted to go with him. Not because she liked him, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because if he really could do what she'd seen him do today, then by his side she'd be able to record things that no one had ever recorded before. She wanted to be the first to document the score of the impossible. Ian looked at her, at the stack of papers on her desk, at the ink stains on her fingers, at the gray eyes that saw in him not a musician but a phenomenon. He thought that the last time someone had looked at him like that was Professor Kowalski at the Boston Conservatory. He, too, had seen in him an instrument rather than a person. But Sora was different. She didn't want to use him. She wanted to understand. Ian nodded and said that the caravan was leaving the day after tomorrow at dawn. Sora stood up and gathered her papers. At the door, she turned around and said one more thing. She said that when he played the Northern Melody on the lute, she burst into tears. Not because of its beauty, because of her anger. Because for 20 years she'd been told that what she heard didn't exist, and he'd just played it out loud for the whole tavern. She left. Ian sat alone. He finished his ale. Rain was falling outside the window, and every drop on the tin eaves rang out its own note. He listened to the rain and thought about how, in this world, his hearing wasn't a profession. It was a weapon. And like any weapon, it could protect, or it could destroy. The caravan set out at dawn. 6 wagons, 20 merchants, 10 of Torvald's mercenaries, and 2 extra passengers whom no one was expecting. Ian sat in the rear wagon with a lute on his lap. Sora sat beside him and wrote. She wrote all the time, every note she heard, every observation. She had a special way of writing things down, not standard Kaelian notation, but her own. She added symbols for overtones and microtones that didn't exist in official notation.
Ian looked at her papers and, for the first time in a week, felt something resembling joy. This girl had invented a spectrogram, a rough one, an imprecise one, but a working one. She was drawing the sound exactly he saw it on the monitor in the studio. The road wound through the forest. The trees here made sounds, not like on Earth. Each tree had its own tone. The oaks hummed low, the birches rang high, the pines hissed like drum cymbals. Ian closed his eyes and listened to the forest as if it were a mix. Too many low frequencies. He needed an equalizer. He smiled. Old habits. On the second day of their journey, Torvald joined them by the campfire that evening. He was sober and serious. He asked Ian where he was from. Ian named the first town he'd heard about from the innkeeper in the village. Torvald nodded, but his eyes were skeptical. Then he asked which master Ian had studied under. Ian named the dead man from the ditch. Torvald paused and said he knew that man, that his name was Harold Finch, that he was a lousy musician but a good man, and that if Harold had taught Ian to play the way he had played in the tavern, then the old man must have been the best teacher on the continent, which was hardly likely. Ian didn't say anything. Torvald patted him on the shoulder and said that everyone has their secrets and that he wouldn't pry. But he added one thing. He said there was a man in the caravan from the Guild of the Pure Word, a merchant who wasn't really a merchant. The third wagon, a thin man with long fingers. Torvald said that this man listened to everyone in the caravan every evening, and that Ian had better not do anything out of the ordinary until they reached Venreath. Ian thanked him. That night, he didn't play. He sat by the campfire and listened. The thin man from the third wagon was indeed listening. Ian could hear him tense his throat every time someone nearby cast a spell, a microscopic muscle contraction. He was checking the purity of their pronunciation. A guild agent. Sora was sitting nearby and wasn't sleeping either. She said quietly that the Pure Word Guild was in a panic right now, that the Silent One had passed through 3 villages in the north last month, that 400 people had lost their hearing, and that the guild was looking for anyone with unusual abilities, not to protect them, but to study and exploit them. Ian asked what she knew about the Silent One. Sora paused. Then she said that, according to rumors, he was a former great mage, someone who had been stripped of his voice long ago, someone who had learned to cast magic without sound. Exactly how, no one knew. It seemed as impossible as playing a spell on a lute. Ian thought about it. Magic without sound. For him, as a sound engineer, it was like a song without frequencies. Without a wave, there is no sound. Without sound, there is no magic. But the Silent One somehow managed it, so either the rules were more complex than they seemed, or there was a sound he couldn't hear. That thought wouldn't leave him alone. On the 4th day of their journey, the caravan stopped near a village, a small place, a dozen houses, a well, and silence. Not ordinary silence, dead silence. Ian sensed it immediately. The trees around the village made no sound. The grass was silent. Even the wind here was muffled, as if someone had turned the world's volume all the way down to 0. Torvald stopped the caravan and went ahead with 2 mercenaries. He returned half an hour later. His face was ashen. He said the village was alive, the people were unharmed, but no one could hear. Every single one of them had gone deaf. Children, old people, even the dogs. The Silent One had been here, maybe a week ago, maybe 2. Ian jumped down from the wagon and headed into the village. Sora followed him. They found the villagers in the square by the well, 20 people. They sat in silence, staring straight ahead. Not because they were in shock, they simply didn't know what to do. They couldn't hear each other. They couldn't hear their children. They couldn't hear the wind. The world had gone silent for them. A woman holding a child in her arms was rocking back and forth, her lips moving silently. She was singing a lullaby she couldn't hear. Ian stood before her and closed his eyes. He listened. He listened more deeply than ever before. Amid the village's silence, he searched for the faintest trace of sound. Traces, any resonance. And he found it. Deep down,
at a frequency the ordinary ear couldn't perceive. Infrasound. No, below infrasound. At a frequency that didn't exist in his earthly classification. Something below the threshold of hearing, but above complete silence. The silent one didn't remove the sound. He set a block, like a noise gate in a studio. A filter that didn't let the signal through below a certain threshold. But the filter didn't destroy the sound, it suppressed it. And if he found the right frequency, he could open the gate again. Ian didn't try. Not now, not here. He didn't know how much power was needed or what would happen if he made a mistake. He placed his hand on the woman's shoulder. She looked up. He gestured that he'd be back. She didn't understand, but nodded. On the way back to the caravan, Sora asked what he'd heard. Ian said that the silent one doesn't take away your hearing, he locks it away. Sora stopped. She looked at him for a long time and said that if that was true, then hearing could be restored. Ian nodded, but he added that to do so, he would need much more than he currently had. He needed to understand how this filter worked, and to do that, he needed to hear the silent one's magic up close. And that was the problem, because the silent one's magic was silence. And you can't hear silence. On the 5th day of the journey, a thin man from the 3rd wagon approached Ian. He introduced himself as a cloth merchant named Krennis. He asked how long Ian had been playing the lute. Ian said for a long time. Krennis asked who had taught him. Ian mentioned the name Harold Finch. Krennis nodded and said it was a good name. Then he asked if Ian would play something for his fellow travelers that evening. Ian agreed. He played simple melodies, nothing out of the ordinary. No spells, no overtones, just music. Krennis listened and smiled, but his throat didn't relax for a second. He was searching. He hadn't found it yet, but he was searching. After the concert, Sora told Ian that Krennis was memorizing every note he played. Ian replied that he knew, and that they needed to get to Venreath faster than Krennis could get to the truth. The caravan reached Venreath on the 8th day. The city was enormous. White walls, towers, wide streets paved with stone. And the sound. Venreath sounded like a conservatory where everyone was rehearsing at once. Magic poured out of every window. Academy students were practicing on their harmonicas. Market vendors lured customers with songs, lightly enhanced by magic. The streetlights were lit by the caretaker's voice every evening. The city lived and breathed sound, and for the first time in this world, Ian felt at home. Not because he knew the place, but because this city was a recording studio the size of a city block. Torvald said goodbye to them at the gate. He slapped Ian on the back. He said that if the boy ever found himself in the northern mountains, he should seek out the Grönhammar clan and play for them. They'd appreciate it. Then he looked serious and added quietly that Krennis would be heading to the guild to report shortly, and that Ian had about 2 days before they came looking for him with questions. Ian thanked him and they parted ways. Sora knew the city. She'd spent 4 years here before being expelled. She led Ian to the musicians' quarter. Narrow streets, instrument repair shops, cheap rooms above taverns. This was where those who hadn't made it into the academy or had been expelled lived. Wandering bards, music copyists, tuners. All those who made their living from sound but weren't allowed to call themselves mages. Sora rented 2 rooms in the house of an old woman named Nira. Nira was a former singer. Her voice had long since failed her, but her ear for music remained. She listened as Ian played a scale on the lute and said that the instrument was shoddy, but his hands were good. Then she went off to make tea. Ian spent his first day in Venreath listening to the city. He walked the streets and soaked it all in. The pure speech resounded everywhere. 12 basic harmonics. He arranged them that morning. The first harmonic was warmth, fire, light. A note on C in the 3rd octave with a characteristic overtone a 5th above. The second was cold, ice, slowness, a F sharp with a descending overtone. The third was movement, wind, a push, a D flat with a double overtone, and so on. By evening, he had recorded all 12, Not on paper, in his head, just as he used to record tracks in the studio on Tremont Street. Each harmonica was like a separate track in a mix, and together they created what the Academy called the full palette of magic. But Ian heard more. There were gaps between the harmonics, frequencies the Academy didn't use, or didn't know about, or was hiding. Sora confirmed it.
She said it was precisely those gaps that cost her her career.
She wrote her dissertation on the 13th harmonic, a frequency that existed between the 4th and 5th fundamental harmonics. The professors said it was noise, that her hearing was faulty, that the 13th harmonic couldn't exist because pure speech is perfect and contains no gaps. Sora was expelled. Her dissertation was burned. Ian listened to her story and thought about how similar all worlds are. In Boston, his acoustics professor had said that human hearing is limited to 20,000 hertz. Ian could hear 24. The professor said it was an artifact, a brain error, noise. The next day, Ian began playing on the streets. He needed money and he needed a reputation. Not too big, just enough to get invited to fairs and receptions where he could hear magic up close. He played in the square by the fountain, simple melodies, folk songs he'd picked up along the way. People stopped and listened. They tossed coins. They smiled. Ian played cleanly and beautifully, but nothing more. Nothing that would catch the guild's attention. Sora sat nearby and took notes. Not on his playing, she was taking notes on the passers-by. Every mage who passed by left a sonic trail, the residual vibrations of their last spell. Sora heard them and recorded them. By the evening of the second day, she had a map of Venreath's magical accents. Who used which harmonic most often? Who was out of tune? Who was hiding their true accent? Ian studied the map and saw a pattern. All 12 harmonics were present, but in varying proportions. The 1st, 3rd, and 7th dominated. Fire, movement, connection. The others appeared less frequently. And the 12th hadn't appeared even once. He asked Sora what the 12th harmonic was. She turned pale. The 12th harmonic is silence. The fundamental note of silence. A frequency that doesn't create sound, but dampens it. Anti-sound. Destructive interference. Ian knew this principle. Active noise cancellation. Noise-canceling headphones worked exactly the same way. A wave of the same frequency in antiphase. Sound plus anti-sound equals silence. The silent one possessed the 12th harmonic, or something based on it. Ian realized this instantly. He wasn't creating silence out of nothing. He generated anti-sound, an exact copy of every sound around him, but out of phase. That's why the mages near him lost their ability to cast spells. Their spells were cancelled out by their own reflections. That's why people went silent. Their hearing was overwhelmed by anti-sound, a filter, a noise gate. It all made sense. But how could he reproduce this without sound? How could he generate a wave without emitting a wave? Ian didn't know. Not yet, anyway. On the 3rd day in Venray, they came for them. Not the guild, worse. 3 people in white robes, hoods, quiet voices, perfect diction. The choir of the 7 throats. They stood at Nira's door and waited. Ian went out to meet them. The eldest of the 3 was a woman in her 50s. She said that their order had heard of a musician who played foreign magic on his strings. She said this calmly and without threat, but Ian heard in her voice the same note he'd heard in Cronus's. A search. She was looking for him. She didn't yet know how dangerous he was, but she wanted to find out. Ian replied that he was just a wandering musician with a good ear. The woman smiled and said that a good ear was a gift, and that a gift must be used properly. She invited him to come to the Temple of Hora for an audition. If his hearing was truly that good, the order might take him under its protection. Ian politely declined. The woman nodded. She said the offer remained open. Then she left. Sora had been standing behind the door, listening to the entire conversation. When Ian returned inside, she said that was bad. The Order of the 7 Sips doesn't make offers, it makes final offers. If Ian didn't come to the audition voluntarily, they would come for him. And not to teach him, to exploit him. The order used people with good hearing as living instruments. It forced them to sing for hours on end, to hold a note until their voices gave out, and then it recorded their sound onto a crystal and discarded the used shell. Ian sat down on the bed and thought. 2 days until the guild's visit, based on Cronus's tip. The choir is already here. The language keepers will surely find out soon too. 3 forces, 3 hunters, and 1 wandering musician with a lute and a young woman who transcribes the music. He needed more people, more cover, more information. He looked at Sora and said they needed an ensemble, a real one, with a repertoire and a performance schedule. A wandering musician draws attention. A wandering ensemble is business as usual. They'll play at fairs and in taverns and at private receptions. That will give them access to mages of all schools. That will give them cover. And that will give him time to gather what he needs. The world's musical score. Every school, every dialect, every harmony, including the 12th. Sora adjusted her glasses and said she knew a girl, a young one, from the eastern province. She controls puppets with her voice. She's currently living in Venray without money or a patron because her type of magic is considered lowly and rustic. She performs at children's parties in exchange for food, but her vocal technique is something entirely different. It's not pure speech, it's another dialect, an old one, almost dead. Ian nodded and said he wanted to hear her. Mei-Rin So was performing at a children's party in the Weaver's Quarter. When Ian and Sora found her, she was standing on an upside-down crate in front of a crowd of 10 children and 3 bored mothers. 3 dolls sat at her feet, wooden ones, painted, with movable arms and heads. Mei-Rin was small, thin, with short black hair and a round face. Her clothes were patched in 4 places. She smiled so broadly it was as if she were performing before the royal court. Then she began to sing. Ian froze. It wasn't a song in the usual sense. It was a language, an ancient one, a strange one. The syllables were short and sharp. Each syllable was linked to a specific gesture by the puppet. She sang 3 syllables, and the first puppet stood up. She sang 2 more, and the puppet raised its hand. 3 more, and the second puppet turned its head toward the first. The children squealed with delight. The mothers yawned. And Ian stood with his mouth agape because he was hearing something no one else could hear. Mei-Rin's voice operated on 3 layers simultaneously. The main tone consisted of the control syllables. The puppets moved in response to them. But beneath the main tone lay a second layer, quiet, almost inaudible, an overtone that had nothing to do with the dolls. It carried emotion, joy, sadness, surprise. The dolls weren't just moving, they felt. And there was a third layer, the deepest one, infrasonic. At a frequency Ian could barely detect. This layer did something to the air around the puppets. It created a faint shimmer, like a heat haze over the asphalt on a hot day. The children couldn't see it, but Ian could, and he could hear. And it wasn't just a puppet dialect. It was a full-fledged magical language with 3 levels of encoding, more complex than pure speech, older, and it was considered a village trick to entertain children. When the show was over, Mei-Rin gathered the puppets into a canvas bag and counted the coins. 4 copper coins. She looked at them and sighed. Then she saw Ian and Sora and smiled. She asked if they wanted to book a performance. There was a discount for children. It was more expensive for adults, but they could work something out. Sora started to explain, but Ian stopped her. He crouched down in front of the bag and asked if he could look at the puppets. Mei-Rin grew wary. Then she took one out, a female figure with long hair made of black thread. Ian took the puppet and held it to his ear. The wood still retained a residual vibration, that very third layer, an infrasonic trail. He set the doll down and looked at Mei-Rin. He said that her voice operated on 3 levels, that the first level moved the dolls, that the second level gave them emotions, and that the third level did something else that he didn't yet fully understand. Mei-Rin stopped smiling. She took the doll and pressed the bag to her chest. Her voice changed. It became low and rapid. She asked how he knew that, who had sent him. He was from the guild, from the choir, from the order of the language keepers. Because they had all come to her. Everyone wanted her dolls. Everyone wanted her voice. Ian raised his hands, palms forward. He said he was a traveling musician, that he played the lute, that he was putting together an ensemble, and that he needed a puppeteer. Not her voice, not her secrets, her skill, on stage, for money. He offered her a share of the proceeds from the performances, an honest contract between artists. Mei-Rin looked at him, then at Sora, then back at him. She asked how much. Ian said a third. Mei-Rin said half. Sora said there were 3 people in the ensemble and a third was mathematically fair. Mei-Rin thought for a moment and said a third would be fine if they let her eat twice a day. Ian agreed.
Mei-Rin smiled again. She said she hadn't eaten twice a day in a long time. They walked back to Nira's house. On the way, Mei-Rin talked non-stop. She told them she was born in the Eastern Province, that her family had been traveling puppeteers for 8 generations, that her mother could animate 5 puppets at once while still holding a conversation, that her father built puppets from a special kind of wood that grew only in the Eastern Mountains, that her family was no longer there. She said this between a story about her favorite porridge and a complaint about how expensive thread was. She just let it slip. They're gone. They were killed 2 years ago. People in gray cloaks. They came at night. They took all the puppets. They burned the wagon. She survived because she was hiding in a trash pit with the 3 dolls she'd managed to grab. Ian didn't ask who exactly. Sora didn't say anything either. But they exchanged glances and both thought the same thing. The gray cloaks. The language guardians. The very ones who protected the dialects, or destroyed those who spoke them. That evening, Ian sat in the room and thought. Mei-Rin was sleeping downstairs in Nira's kitchen. She'd fallen asleep instantly, like someone who hadn't slept safely in a long time. Sora came to him with some papers. She laid out her notes on the table. The 12 harmonics of pure speech. Next to them, Mei-Rin's puppet dialect. Torvald's northern throat singing. 3 different systems, 3 different languages of magic. But Ian looked at them and saw what they had in common. Like a producer who listens to 3 demos from different bands and hears that all 3 are playing in the same key. The fundamental tone of the first harmonic of pure speech coincided with the fundamental tone of the first syllable of the puppet dialect, to within a quarter tone. Torvald's throat overtone fell exactly between the second and third harmonics, in that very gap that the Academy considered a void. 3 systems, 1 key, different arrangements. Ian looked up at Sora. He said that pure speech wasn't original, it's a mixed version. A long time ago, someone took fragments of different dialects and compiled 12 harmonics from them, discarded the excess, cleaned it up, normalized it. Just like a studio producer puts together a hit from samples. Sora took off her glasses. Her hands were shaking. She said that meant every pure speech spell was built on someone's stolen note. Ian nodded. Every spell, every harmonic, every lesson at the Academy. It was all stolen. And then he thought about himself, about what he himself was doing. He hears other people's magic, copies it, transfers it, arranges it. How was he any different from the person who, 200 years ago, pieced together pure speech from dead dialects? He knew the difference. Intention. That person stole and hid it. Ian wanted to hear it and return it. But the difference between stealing and returning is sometimes thinner than a quarter tone. The next morning, the ensemble began rehearsing. Ian played the lute. Sora kept the beat on a small drum she'd borrowed from Nira. Mei-Rin worked with the puppets. They prepared 3 acts, a folk melody, a puppet skit, and a finale in which Ian accompanied the puppets on the lute while Sora kept the beat. A simple performance. No magic, no overtones, pure craftsmanship. Their first performance was at the evening market. The crowd was small. The coins were small. But people laughed and clapped. Mei-Rin beamed. The puppets danced. Sora pounded the drum with such a focused expression, as if she were conducting a symphony orchestra. After the performance, the innkeeper from the establishment on the corner approached them. He offered them a spot to play at his place every evening in exchange for dinner and a room. Ian agreed. That was the beginning. Small and humble. 3 people, 1 lute, 1 drum, 3 puppets. But Ian knew this was only the first step. Ahead lay more voices, more instruments, more dialects that needed to be heard. And somewhere far away, at the edge of the world, a man was walking who made not a sound. And the silence behind him grew. The ensemble played at the Copper Threshold Tavern every evening for 2 weeks. Ian counted the days. He counted the coins. He counted the sounds. Every evening, different people sat in the hall, and each brought their own accent with them. Merchants from the coast breathed differently than the townspeople. Their vowels were longer. The overtones floated like waves. Mercenaries from the south clicked their tongues when they cursed, and Ian caught snippets of a desert dialect in those clicks. Over the course of 2 weeks, he gathered fragments of 4 new magical accents without uttering a single spell aloud. He just listened. He just memorized. Mei-Rin settled in quickly. She ate 3 times a day instead of the promised 2 because Nira fed her between breakfast and lunch. Her dolls became a local attraction. Children came to the tavern specifically to see them. Mei-Rin let each child hold a doll by the hand, and the dolls turned their heads toward the children as if they were alive. It wasn't magic as the Academy understood it. It was something simpler and, at the same time, more complex. Sora kept taking notes. Her notebooks were piling up, 3 stacks on the table. The first was a catalog of accents. The second was a comparative table of harmonics. The third was a diary of her observations of Ian. She wrote down everything he did with sound, every microtonal shift, every hunch. She said that someday it would become a book. Ian said that first they had to stay alive. On the 16th day in Venray, a letter arrived. Not for Ian, for Nir. The old woman read it over breakfast and turned pale. Then she placed the letter on the table and said that the Guild of the Pure Word had announced a special inspection of all street musicians in the city. Anyone who performs for money must audition at the academy and obtain a license. This hadn't been required before. Before, street musicians were free. But now the guild was looking for specific individuals and was using the inspection as a dragnet. Ian looked at Sora. Sora looked at Ian. Crinus had reached the guild faster than they'd expected. They had 3 days before the inspections began. Ian said the ensemble was leaving Venreath. Sora objected. She said that leaving now would only confirm their suspicions. If they disappeared on the day the inspections were announced, the guild would realize they'd been on the right track. It was better to go through the audition. To play it by the book, nothing extra. Get the license and leave quietly in a week, just like ordinary traveling performers. Ian thought about it. She was right. Running away was more dangerous than staying. The audition took place in a small hall at the academy. White walls, high ceilings, perfect acoustics. Ian could hear the sound bouncing off every surface and returning slightly altered. The hall had been tuned. Every stone had been selected for its density to resonate at a specific frequency. Whoever had built this place knew acoustics better than any architect on Earth. 3 examiners sat at the table. 2 were young mages in the academy's blue robes. The third was older, in his 50s. A gaunt face, dark eyes, a silver pin on his collar. Not just a tuning fork, but a 3-pronged one, the highest rank in the guild. Ian heard his breathing and realized that this man was not just an examiner. He was a listener, a professional. His ears were trained to detect microtonal inaccuracies, almost like Ian's. Almost. The audition was simple. Play 3 melodies. The first was a folk song, the second a classical piece, the third the performer's choice. Ian played the folk song he'd learned in the first village. Cleanly. No overtones, no magic, just good lute playing. The examiner with 3 fangs listened without moving.
The second melody, a classical piece from the Venraith school. Ian had learned it in 2 days by listening to the academy students rehearsing through the wall. He played it precisely, note for note, beat for beat. Not a single extra overtone. The examiner tilted his head slightly, the third piece of his choice. Ian played a lullaby, a simple one, a quiet one. The one he'd heard from a woman in a remote village, the one she sang to her child without even realizing she was singing. He played it without magic, but with something that wasn't magic, with memory, with the pain of that woman who rocked her child in the silence. The hall fell silent. One of the young examiners lowered his eyes. The examiner with 3 teeth didn't move a muscle. When Ian finished, the chief examiner stood up. He walked over to him. He stopped 2 steps away. He said the melody was beautiful. Then he asked where Ian had heard it. Ian said, in a village along the road. The examiner nodded. Then he said quietly that in this lullaby there is a quarter tone between the 3rd and 4th notes, that this quarter tone does not belong to any of the 12 harmonics, that it is characteristic of a dead Eastern dialect that has not been heard in Venray for over 100 years, and that an uneducated, wandering musician could not possibly know this quarter tone, unless he hears things he shouldn't hear. Ian remained silent. His heart beat steadily. He controlled his breathing. Not a single muscle in his throat twitched. Because this man wasn't listening to the words, he was listening to the body. The examiner waited 5 seconds. Then he smiled. He said the license would be ready in the morning, and that his name was Anselm Varro, an inquisitor of the Guild of the Pure Word. He hoped to hear Ian play again. Ian walked out of the hall on wobbly legs. Sora was waiting for him on the street. She asked how it went. Ian said it had gone badly, that the examiner had heard a quarter tone, and that the examiner was Anselm Varro. Sora turned pale. She knew that name. Everyone who had studied at the academy knew that name. Anselm Varro, the benchmark baritone, the voice that the academy had declared the ideal model of pure speech 20 years ago. The inquisitor who had personally carried out the purges of magical dialects in the eastern provinces. The man who believed that purity of pronunciation equaled purity of the world. Ian nodded and said they needed to leave. Not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. Calmly, with a license in their pocket. Just like ordinary traveling musicians. They spent the next day packing their things. Nira gave them enough food to last 3 days. Mei-Rin packed the dolls into a sack and tied it to her back so tightly that the dolls didn't make a sound as she walked. Sora hid her notebooks in the lining of her cloak. In the morning, they received their licenses at the academy's office. 3 wooden tokens with the note "Do" burned into them. Permission to perform on the streets in any city of Caelion. An official document, a legal cover. They left Venray through the southern gates. The road led south toward the desert provinces. Ian chose the south for 2 reasons. First, the language keepers, the clicking dialect. He needed that part of the score. Second, to get as far away from Anselm Varro as possible. They traveled for 3 days. They played in the villages along the way. They earned money for food. Mei-Rin entertained the children with dolls. Sora wrote down everything she heard. Ian listened to the world, and the world sounded increasingly complex. With each passing day, he discerned new layers. An underground rumble at a frequency he'd only learned to hear here. The movement of water in the rivers. The growth of roots beneath the ground. This world was a symphony, and he was only just beginning to make out the first few bars. The desert began gradually. First, the grass grew sparser. Then the earth turned yellow. Then the trees ran out. 5 days' journey from Venraith, the road turned into a path between the rocks, and the path turned into a direction. The heat pressed down from morning until sunset. At night, it was cold. Mei-Rin complained about the sand in her shoes. Sora remained silent and drank water in small sips. Ian listened to the desert. It sounded different from anything he had heard before. The city was an orchestra. The forest was a choir. The desert was one long, drawn-out tone. low, steady, without overtones, like a sine wave on an oscilloscope screen. A pure, unadulterated sound. The sand was singing, not metaphorically, literally. When the wind shifted the dunes, the top layer slid over the bottom, and the vibration traveled through the entire thickness of the sand, creating a sound at a frequency of about 100 hertz. Ian heard this and understood why desert magicians worked differently. Their environment was pure, no sonic clutter, no interference. Every click of the tongue in that silence sounded like a gunshot, every whistle like a siren. Desert magic was neither louder nor quieter than city magic. It was more precise. On the 7th day of their journey, they encountered a caravan. 12 camels, 8 people, a load covered with cloth. The caravanners looked at them without interest. Wandering musicians are not uncommon in the desert. Oases are boring. Any entertainment is worth the water. The head caravaner suggested they travel together to the next oasis. A 2-day journey, it's safer in a group. Ian agreed. That evening, by the campfire, the caravan drivers opened up. They were coming from the southwest, from the deep desert, from the lands where the language keepers lived. The lead caravan driver spoke calmly about it, but the others were nervous. One of the younger men said that the order had become more aggressive. They stop caravans. They check to see if anyone is carrying sound crystals. They confiscate any records of magical dialects, even trade spells used to preserve goods. If a caravan driver utters a formula that even remotely resembles a desert dialect, they are interrogated. Sometimes they're let go. Sometimes they aren't. Ian listened and committed it to memory. The language guardians. An order that preserved dialects, or controlled them. The difference was subtle. The following evening, Ian played for the caravanners. Mei-Rin put on a puppet show. Sora kept the beat. A simple performance, but after the show, one of the caravanners approached Ian and quietly told him that 2 days' journey away lay the village of Al-Hadim. That people lived there who remembered the old songs. Not magical ones, just songs. But if a musician with a good ear listened, he would understand that there was more to these songs than met the eye. Ian thanked him. The caravan left in the morning. The ensemble headed for Al-Hadim. The village stood by a spring, 30 mud brick houses, palm trees, goats, children playing in the dust. An ordinary place, but Ian heard the difference right away. The people here spoke differently, not in the Venreath language, in another language. Similar, but with clicks. Short, sharp sounds between syllables, like percussion woven into speech. A clicking dialect, not complete, just fragments, mixed in with the common language. But alive. The troupe stopped at a spring. Mei-Rin was watering the puppets. She did this every time they stopped by the water. She dipped the doll's wooden legs into the water and muttered something in her doll dialect. Ian didn't ask why. He understood. It was a ritual, a memory of her mother. The village elder came to them an hour later, a short, broad-shouldered man with dark skin and a gray beard. He asked who they were and what they wanted. Ian said they were traveling musicians, that they were heading south, that they wanted water and a place to stay for the night, and were willing to pay with music. The elder looked at the lute, at the dolls, at Sora's notebook. Then he nodded. That evening, the ensemble played for the village. The people listened. The children danced. The goats bleated. And standing among the audience was a woman who neither danced nor smiled. Tall, weather-beaten, dark hair braided into a tight plait. Her skin was tanned by the sun. A knife hung from her belt. Around her neck was a necklace of small bones. She stood with her arms crossed and looked at Ian the way Sora had looked at him the first time. Not at the music, at his fingers, at his throat, at the way he breathed between notes. After the performance, she approached, not Ian, to Mei-Rin. She spoke 3 words in a language with clicks. Mei-Rin flinched. She didn't understand the words, but recognized the rhythm. The same rhythm as in her puppet dialect. The same pattern of clicks. The woman turned to Ian. She said in the common tongue that her name was Nia al-Safar, that she was a tracker, that her father was from the Order of the Tongue Keepers, and her mother from the Free Tribe of al-Safar. and that she had heard Ian play a note on the lute known only to those born in the desert. Ian replied that he wasn't born in the desert, that he'd picked up that note from a caravan driver 2 days ago. He'd picked it up from the man's speech, from the way the caravan driver clicked his tongue when he said the word water. Nia was silent for a long time. Then she sat down by the fire. She didn't ask for permission. She sat down as if the spot belonged to her. Then she said she needed to go west. That 3 days' journey away there was a gorge through which trade routes passed, that it was storm season now and the gorge couldn't be crossed without a guide. She could be the guide, if they took her with them. Ian asked why she was heading west. Nia paused. Then she replied briefly, because her father was still in the east, and she couldn't go back to him. He didn't ask why. In the morning, the 4 of them set out from Al-Hadim. Nia walked ahead. She moved through the desert like a fish in water. She knew where the rocks were, where the sand could bear weight, where it gave way. Mei-Rin walked beside her and tried to strike up a conversation. Nia answered with a single word for every 3 sentences Mei-Rin spoke. Sometimes she didn't answer at all. Mei-Rin wasn't offended. She was used to talking to dolls, and they didn't answer either. On the 2nd day of their journey, the wind picked up. By noon, it had become a wall. Sand lashed their faces. Visibility dropped to 5 steps. Nia stopped the group. She said they needed shelter. There was nothing nearby, just flat desert in every direction. Nia crouched down and placed her palms on the sand. She closed her eyes and clicked her tongue. Once, briefly, sharply. Ian heard it and froze. It wasn't just a click. It was a probing pulse, like a submarine sonar. The sound went into the sand and came back. Nia read the echo. She stood up and pointed to the southeast. There were rocks there, a crevice, 200 paces. They reached the crevice in 10 minutes. A narrow passage between 2 rocks. It was dry inside. The wind couldn't reach them. They sat down and waited. The storm roared outside. Ian sat and listened to the storm. Thousands of frequencies layered on top of one another. White noise, but not quite white. There was a pattern to it, a repeating pattern. Ian closed his eyes and began to break it down. The storm's fundamental tone. The wind at a frequency of 200 hertz. Over that, sand at 500. Higher up, rocks at 1,000. And even higher, something strange. A high-pitched whistle. Not the wind, not the sand. Something alive. Ian opened his eyes and looked at Nia. She could hear it too. He could tell by the look on her face. She clicked again, twice, 3 times. Quickly, each click at a different pitch. She was listening to the echoes, and her expression was changing. She said the storm wasn't coming on its own. Someone was driving it. A caravan 5 miles to the west. 7 people. They're using a desert battle spell to create a wall of sand. Not a natural phenomenon. Made by people. Someone is attacking the caravan, and the caravan is defending itself. Ian stood up. Sora grabbed his arm. She said it wasn't their business. That getting involved in someone else's fight in the desert was suicide. Ian looked at her, then at Nia. Nia was silent, but she was already standing, a knife in her hand. Mei-Rin sat in the corner, clutching a bag of dolls to her chest. She said quietly that when her family was attacked, there had been a storm too, a wall of sand, and no one came. Ian looked at her. Then he turned toward the exit of the crevice. The storm was howling. 5 miles. He couldn't walk 5 miles through a wall of sand. But maybe he didn't need to walk. Maybe he needed to play. He picked up the lute. He looked at Nia. He asked her to do what she had been doing a minute ago. Click, probe. But not 3 times, continuously. Create a rhythm. Nia looked at him. Then she began to click. A steady rhythm. 2 clicks per second, each at a different pitch. Ian listened. He tuned into the storm's frequency. The fundamental tone of the wind. 200 hertz. He found that note on the lute, The first string. Open. He began to play. Not against the wind, with the wind. The same frequency, the same rhythm, but with one difference. He added to the note the northern throat overtone he'd learned from Torvald, an overtone that moved objects. On top of that, he layered Nia's clicking rhythm. 2 layers. The northern tone over the southern rhythm. A fusion. The first true fusion of the 2 schools. The lute hummed. The sound wet out. Through the crevice. Into the storm. Ian couldn't see what was happening, but he could hear it. The wind was changing. The frequencies shifted. The wall of sand in front of the caravan began to part. Not all of it. A narrow strip. A corridor through the storm. Wide enough for people to pass through. Ian played for 3 minutes. Then he stopped. His hands were shaking. Blood was running from his nose. His head was splitting. He fell onto his back and closed his eyes. Mei-Rin was nearby. She was wiping his face with a wet rag. Sora was checking his pulse. Nia stood at the entrance and listened. The storm was subsiding, either on its own or because the attackers had left. An hour later, it was all over. Nia went out to scout. She returned 2 hours later. She was accompanied by 3 people, caravan travelers, wounded, frightened, alive. The eldest among them was a man of about 60. He said they'd been attacked by bandits, 7 of them, that the bandits had raised a wall of sand to cut the caravan off from the road, that then the wall suddenly parted and they were able to escape. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but he and his men were alive. He asked who they were. Ian lay on his back, staring at the sky. Blood was still oozing from his nose. His voice was hoarse. He said they were traveling musicians and that they'd had a successful concert. They walked west for another 4 days. Ian was recovering slowly. His head ached. His voice was hoarse. He hadn't touched his lute for 2 days. His body reminded him that he wasn't a mage, that he didn't have a trained diaphragm, no magical lungs, no energy reserves. He was an ordinary man who had pushed himself beyond his limits. Nia walked ahead in silence. She rarely spoke at all. 5 sentences a day, sometimes 4. But every word was worth 10. When she said it was safe ahead, it meant she'd scanned the area for 2 kilometers with her clicks and found nothing. When she said they needed to stop, it meant a storm was coming in an hour. She had never been wrong. Mei-Rin walked beside her and filled the silence. She talked about her dolls, their names, their personalities, and how the 3rd doll, the one with the red hat, loved sweets and was cranky in the mornings. Nia listened in silence. Sometimes the corner of her mouth would lift slightly. That was as much as she'd show. On the 3rd day of their journey, Mei-Rin asked Nia why she couldn't go back to her father. Nia was silent for so long that Mei-Rin decided she wouldn't answer. But then Nia spoke. She said her father held a high rank in the order of the language keepers, that he had taught her the clicking dialect since she was 3, that he loved her, but that the order had demanded she undergo a trial. She had to destroy a village. Not the people, their voices, their dialect. The village in the south spoke a mixed dialect, half desert, half coastal. The language guardians considered this a desecration. A mixed dialect is filth. Nia was supposed to go to the village and recite the formula of oblivion, a spell that erases certain sounds from people's memories. Afterward, they would be unable to utter a single word in their dialect. They would forget it forever. Nia refused. Her father didn't say a word. He simply turned away. And so she became an outcast. Half her blood came from the order, half from the free tribe, and she didn't belong anywhere. Mei-Rin was silent for a long time after that story. Then she took a doll with a red hat out of her bag and held it out to Nia. She said the doll wanted to sit on her shoulder. Nia took the doll. She didn't smile, but she didn't refuse either. The doll sat on her shoulder until evening. On the 4th day, they reached the gorge, a narrow passage between the cliffs. The walls rose 30 meters high. The bottom was sandy. The shadows were cold. Nia said it would take a day's journey to cross the gorge. On the other side was a junction of trade trails. From there, one could head west toward the coast or north back to the Greenlands. They entered the gorge in the morning. By noon, the walls had closed in so much that the sun could no longer reach the bottom. Ian walked and listened. The gorge sounded like a trumpet. Every sound was amplified by the walls and echoed dozens of times. Mei-Rin's footsteps returned to him a second later, amplified twofold. Nia's breathing resonated in the rock like a distant drum. It was a natural echo chamber, and someone was using it. Ian stopped. He raised his hand. Everyone froze. He heard it. Far ahead, maybe half a mile. A voice, no, voices. 7 voices. Singing in unison. A single note. Pure, high-pitched, uninterrupted. As if 7 people were breathing with a single set of lungs. The choir of the 7 throats. They were in the gorge. Nia clicked softly. She listened to the echo. She said there was a dead end ahead. A pile of rocks blocked the gorge. The choir stood in front of the blockage. And someone else, one person, behind the blockage. They'd trapped someone. Ian listened more closely. 7 voices were pressing down. Their note was more than just a sound. It was a spell of suppression. It compressed the air in front of it like a hydraulic press. Whoever was behind the blockage couldn't move, couldn't breathe deeply. All they could do was wait for the pressure to crush them. And then he heard something else, from behind the rubble. Quiet, almost inaudible beneath the pressure of the 7 voices. Singing. A single voice. A woman's. Young. She wasn't fighting the pressure. She was singing a lullaby. Quiet. Trembling, as if the one singing knew this was the last song. Mei-Rin grabbed Ian's hand. She could hear it too. Not the lullaby. She couldn't hear that far. She heard something else. She heard a choir. And she recognized the technique. 7 voices at once. It wasn't a choir of 7 people. It was a single singer singing for 7. The 7-voice choir technique. So on one side of the rubble stood a squad of the choir, and on the other was a fugitive, a choir member who had run away and been cornered. Ian looked at Sora. Sora shook her. She understood what he was thinking, and she knew it was madness. 7 trained mage choristers against a musician with a lute. Ian turned to Nia. Nia pulled out a knife. That was enough. Ian sat down on a rock. He took the lute off his shoulder. He closed his eyes. He listened. 7 voices. 1 frequency. The suppression spell was based on the 3rd harmonic of pure speech. The note D-flat with a double overtone. Movement, pressure, power. But all 7 voices sang in unison. The same note, the same overtone, the same rhythm. Perfect unison. And therein lay their weakness. Unison amplified their power, but it left no room for correction. If the fundamental frequency shifted, all 7 voices would shift together. They were bound together, like 7 strings tuned to a single pitch. Pluck one, and they all tremble. Ian opened his eyes. He began to play, quietly, barely audible. The same note, D-flat, but not in unison with the choir. A quarter tone higher, exactly in that gap between harmonics that the Academy considered empty. The sound of the lute traveled through the gorge. The walls amplified it. The reflections layered upon one another. And 10 seconds later, the choir wavered. The quarter tone deviation created an interference, a pulsation in the sound that the trained voices tried to compensate for. But it's impossible to compensate for a quarter tone you can't hear. The voices began to drift apart. At first, just a little, then more noticeably. The unison broke down in 30 seconds. The pressure in front of the blockage collapsed. Ian heard 7 people cough simultaneously. The spell's failure struck their own vocal cords. Nia had been waiting for this moment. She ran forward through the gorge as silently as a shadow. Ian kept playing. He changed the note every 5 seconds. He didn't let the choir regain their unison. He kept them out of sync. A minute later, he heard screams. Short ones. Then silence. Then Nia's footsteps. She was back. The knife was clean. She hadn't killed anyone. She'd used the clicks. 3 targeted, probing pulses fired point blank. Not lethal, but deafening. 7 choir members lay on the sand with ruptured eardrums. They would live. Their hearing would return in a week. But for now, they were deaf and helpless. Ian and Sora walked past them toward the rubble. Behind the rocks in a narrow crevice sat a girl. Small, thin, pale. Her hair was dirty. Her clothes were torn. She wrapped her arms around her knees and stared at them with huge eyes. Not at their faces, at their throats, at their hands. She was checking to see if they were singing. Sora crouched down in front of her. She said quietly that they weren't from Hora, that they were musicians, that they were here to help. The girl was silent. Then she asked in a whisper how they'd broken the unison. Ian replied that it was the lute, a quarter tone, interference. The girl looked at him, then at the lute, then back at him. She said her name was Hana Cho, that she was a former choir member, that she had run away 3 months ago, and that if they were going somewhere the choir couldn't reach her, she'd go with them. Ian held out his hand to her. Hana recoiled. She couldn't stand being touched. He withdrew his hand. He just nodded and pointed the way. Hana stood up and followed them, keeping her distance, always 3 steps behind, always in the shadows. They emerged from the gorge by evening. By the campfire, Hana sat apart from everyone else. Mei-Rin brought her some water. Hana took the mug without looking at her. She drank in small sips. Then she said quietly that she hadn't drunk clean water in 3 months. Mei-Rin sat down next to her, not too close, but at arm's length, and she began to talk about her dolls. Hana didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. Ian watched them across the campfire. 5 people, a lute, a drum, 3 dolls, a knife, a notebook, and the whisper of a girl who had forgotten how to trust. The ensemble was growing, and along with it, so were the problems. Hannah didn't sing, not once in 2 weeks. She spoke very little. She walked quietly. She ate by herself. She slept by herself. She'd wake up at the slightest sound. Mei-Rin tried to befriend her. She told stories. She showed her the puppets. Hannah listened but didn't respond, like a wall that absorbs sound and gives nothing back. Nia didn't try. She just walked beside her and stayed silent. And, strangely enough, that worked better. Hannah began to walk closer to Nia. Not right next to her, but not 3 steps behind, just 2. Then 1.5. Silence felt safer to Hannah than words. Sora watched and took notes. She whispered to Ian that Hannah was talking to the cats, not to people. When they stopped in villages, Hannah would find the local cats and talk to them, in a soft, purring voice. Not with spells, just sounds. And the cats would come to her. Ian heard it. He heard Hannah call a cat by the well. 2 soft syllables. He heard her purring something as she rocked a kitten on her lap. He heard her washing dishes by the stream and humming to herself. Not a song, just a sound. A quiet murmur on 3 notes. He memorized each of these moments. He stored them in his memory like tracks in a project. It wasn't time yet. Later. The ensemble was heading north, back to the Greenlands. Ian decided they needed time. Time for Hannah to get used to it. Time for the group to become a group, not just a collection of lonely people. They played in the villages along the way. Mei-Rin with her dolls, Ian on the lute, Sora on the drum. Nia sat off to the side and kept watch over the surroundings. Hannah sat even further away and didn't participate, but she listened. Ian could see it. During the performances, her body would change. Her shoulders would drop. Her breathing grew deeper. She listened to the music and something inside her responded, but she didn't sing along. After a week on the road, they reached the town of Rest Hollow. A small town. bigger than a village but smaller than Venreath. Stone houses, a town square, 2 taverns. Ian found work at the larger of the 2. 3 evenings in exchange for food and a room. A good innkeeper, he didn't ask unnecessary questions. The first evening went as usual, the second too. On the third evening, a child came into the tavern, a boy of about 7, barefoot, skinny, his eyes red from crying. He approached the innkeeper and said that his ma was very sick, that the doctor had said there was nothing he could do, that his mother was burning up and wouldn't wake up. The innkeeper shook his head. He gave the boy some bread and sent him home. Ian heard the conversation. He heard the boy's voice. He heard that the boy wasn't just sad, he was panicking. His mother was dying. Ian looked at Sora. She shook her head. She knew what he was thinking, and she knew how this would end. The last time he'd used complex magic, he'd been bedridden with a nosebleed for 2 days. Ian stood up and left the tavern. He found the boy on the street. He followed him to a house on the outskirts of town. Inside, it was dark and hot. A woman was lying on the bed. Her face was flushed. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. She was burning up. Ian leaned in and listened, not with a stethoscope, with his ear. Her lungs were wheezing. Fine, moist wheezes in the lower lobes. The wheezing was rapid. The small bronchi were clogged. Inflammation. Without antibiotics, it would progress to sepsis in 2 days. He'd heard this hundreds of times in his earthly life. Not in people, in recordings, in tracks brought into the studio. When the microphone was too close to the source and picked up the singer's breathing, wheezing, clicks, wet sounds. He'd learned to distinguish healthy lungs from diseased ones by sound before he even realized it was a skill. The woman needed warmth, to reduce the inflammation, to open her bronch. Ian knew the incantation. He'd heard it 2 weeks ago in Al-Hadim. An old woman had sung it to her sick goat. A simple formula, 5 syllables, a soft, warm tone, the harmony of healing, the first harmony of pure speech. Fire, but not destructive, gentle, internal, heat that heals rather than burns. The problem was the power. 5 syllables were enough for the goat. A human needed more, longer, more sustained. But Ian had no reserves. He was an ordinary man with perfect pitch and unhealthy ambitions. He sat down next to the bed. He picked up the lute. He began to play. Softly, on the first harmonic, up to the 3rd octave. A soft, warm tone. An overtone a 5th above. He added a 2nd layer, the From the Desert. The one Hannah sang in the gorge when she thought she was dying. The melody carried a sense of peace, calm. A body that hears this melody stops fighting and begins to heal. The 3rd layer, Nia's clicking rhythm, a probing impulse directed not outward but inward, into the patient's body, so that the sound would find the inflammation and reach that exact spot. 3 schools, 3 layers, 1 melody. He played for 15 minutes. After 5 minutes, the woman's breathing became more even. After 10, her wheezing subsided. After 15 minutes, her fever began to subside. Ian stopped. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't hold the pick. Blood was flowing from his nose and his left ear. His head was ringing like a bell. He slid to the floor next to the bed and closed his eyes. The boy stood in the doorway and watched. Then he walked over to his mother. He touched her forehead. He looked at Ian and quietly said, "Thank you." Sora found him an hour later. She came with Nia. They lifted Ian up and led him back to the tavern. Sora was silent. She was angry. Ian could tell by the way she was clenching her jaw. Once inside the room, she sat him down on the bed and told him he was an idiot, that he'd nearly killed himself, that the blood from his ear was a burst capillary, and that next time something more serious could burst, that he wasn't a mage or a healer, and that it was one thing to perform at the tavern, but quite another to channel 3 schools of magic through himself at once. Ian didn't argue. She was right. He knew she was right. But he also knew that the woman was alive, and that the boy wouldn't be left an orphan. Sora sat down beside him and was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that she understood, that she too wouldn't have been able to walk away, but that if he died from overexertion in the middle of the road, the world's score would die with him, and no one else would ever hear what he hears. Ian lay there and thought. She was right on both counts. He needed to learn to measure his efforts, not to copy spells entirely, but to find the minimum effective fragment. Like in a studio, when a client wants an orchestral sound but the budget only covers 3 instruments, find those 3 notes that would create the illusion of an orchestra. The minimal viable mix. He fell asleep. He slept for 12 hours. He woke up with a headache but alive. He went out into the yard and saw Hannah. She was sitting on the steps petting a cat. A ginger one, a chubby one. The cat was purring on a pure A in the first octave. Hannah was purring along with him. Ian sat down nearby. Not too close. He didn't speak. He just sat there and listened to her purring with the cat. 5 minutes later, Hannah said, without turning around, that she'd heard him playing yesterday. Through the wall. All 3 layers. She said that the second layer was her melody, the one she'd sung in the gorge. Ian nodded. Hannah was silent for a moment. Then she said she wasn't angry. She just wasn't used to someone remembering her sound. In the choir, her sound belonged to the order. Every note she sang became the property of the choir. Her voice, her overtones, her breath. Everything was recorded in crystals and used without her consent. She was an instrument, a living organ from which notes were extracted. When she ran away, she swore that no one would ever take her sound again. And now Ian had taken it. Without asking. It was for a good cause, sure, but he'd taken it all the same. Ian was silent for a long time. Then he said she was right, that he shouldn't have used her melody without asking, that it was his mistake, and that he wouldn't do it again. Hannah looked at him, straight in the eyes for the first time in 2 weeks. Then she said, "All right." She stood up and left. The cat followed her. A month passed. The ensemble traveled from town to town. They played, they earned money, they built a reputation, not a great one, but a quiet one. People in small towns told each other that there were wandering musicians, a lutenist with a pure sound, a puppeteer who brings wooden figures to life, a drummer in glasses who records everything, a silent woman with a knife, and a quiet girl who sits in the shadows and strokes the cats. A strange group, but they play well. And after their concerts, the village somehow feels better. The rain falls at the right time, the milk doesn't turn sour, the elderly sleep more peacefully. Ian knew why. He wove tiny fragments of magic into his concerts. Not full spells, minimal, viable mixes. A single note from the first harmonic in a warm timbre. A quarter-tone overtone that slightly reduces the listener's anxiety. An overtone that makes the muscles relax. Nothing powerful, nothing dangerous. Like music therapy. Like background music in a nice restaurant. You don't notice it, but you feel better. That was his compromise, between the desire to help and the need to protect himself. Hannah began helping with the household chores. Not talking, just helping. She silently washed the dishes after dinner. She silently put things away in the morning. She silently cleaned Ian's lute when he forgot. That was her language. Not words, actions. Ian noticed and didn't comment. He continued to collect her sounds, but now he asked, every time. "Hannah, may I remember how you called that cat? Hannah, may I listen to how you purr when you wash the mugs? Hannah, may I?" She would freeze every time. Think, then nod, or she'd shake her head. And Ian accepted both answers equally. It changed something, slowly. Like a quarter-tone shift, imperceptible to everyone except those who can hear it. One evening by the campfire, Mei-Rin asked Ian to play something new. Ian said he could try something. He took out his lute and began to play a lullaby. But not just any lullaby. He took the melody that Mei-Rin used to hum to her dolls before bedtime, a simple little song with 5 notes. And he began to build it up, adding layers. The first layer was Mei-Rin's melody. The second layer was Torvald's northern overtone, soft, deep, like an embrace. The third layer was a desert rhythm, slow, like the breath of a sleeping child. The lute sang softly. Mei-Rin listened. Her eyes grew wide, then wet. She recognized the melody, but it sounded different, fuller, richer, as if someone had taken a child's drawing and set it in a golden frame, without changing the drawing, simply showing that it deserved a frame. Ian didn't stop. He added a fourth layer, a new voice, that very same doll-like dialect. The 3 layers that Mei-Rin used for her dolls, the basic tone, the emotion, and that deep third layer that even Mei-Rin wasn't aware of in her own voice. Ian reproduced it on the strings, and the doll stirred, not from Mei-Rin's voice, from the lute. The doll with black string hair, the one lying on Mei-Rin's lap, raised its head and turned toward her, and opened its mouth. A sound came from its wooden lips. Not Mei-Rin's voice, the voice of another woman. Older, warmer, with the same timbre but an octave lower. Her mother's voice. Not an exact copy. Ian had never heard Mei-Rin's mother. He couldn't have copied her. But he had heard Mei-Rin. He'd heard her timbre. He'd heard the frequencies she'd inherited. And he extrapolated backward. Like a restorer reconstructing a painting from a surviving fragment. It wasn't her mother's voice. It was a portrait. A vocal portrait. Respectful, cautious, not an imitation, an acknowledgement. Mei-Rin didn't cry. She froze. Her hand reached for the doll and clasped its wooden fingers. She sat like that for a long time. A minute, 2, 3. She held the doll's hand and listened to the voice she hadn't heard in 2 years. Then the doll fell silent. Ian took his hands off the strings. Mei-Rin didn't move. Then she said quietly that the doll had told her good night, just like Mom used to say, every evening. Good night, little one. Ian was silent. Sora was silent. Nia was silent. Hannah stood in the shadows by the tree and watched. Her hands were pressed against her chest. Mei-Rin placed the doll on her lap and stroked its wooden hair. Then she lifted her head and looked at Ian. She didn't say thank you. She said she wanted to learn how to do it herself, so that the doll would speak in her mother's voice whenever Mei-Rin wanted it to. Not all the time, just sometimes, when she missed her very much. Ian nodded. He said he'd teach her. It would take time, but he'd teach her. That night, Mei-Rin slept hugging the doll. For the first time in a long while, she didn't twitch in her sleep. The next day, the troop arrived in the town of Osthaven. Large by provincial standards, 3,000 residents, a market square, a magical lyceum, and rumors. Rumors were coming from all sides. The Silent One had struck again. 3 villages to the west, 150 people lost their hearing in a single night. The guild sent a squad of 5 mages there. Not a single one returned. The choir of the 7 Sips closed all its temples and led the choristers to mountain refuges. The language keepers stopped coming out of the desert. The world was falling silent. Silence was descending. And yet another rumor, quieter than the rest, whispers in the taverns. They said there was a wandering musician, that he played the lute and strange things happened, that after his concerts people felt better, that he could hear illness before it manifested, that his puppets spoke with the voices of the dead, that he had passed through a remote village and understood something about the silence of the Silent One that no one else had grasped. The rumors grew. Ian knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't stop it. You can't play in taverns and remain invisible. You can't heal people and remain a nobody. Every good deed was a step toward exposure. And somewhere in Vinray, Anselm Vero was listening to these rumors. And somewhere in the desert, the tongue keepers heard the name of Ian the string player. And somewhere in the silence, a man walked, without a voice and without lips. And the silence behind him grew. That evening in Osthaven, Ian sat on the roof of the tavern and gazed at the stars. Sora climbed up to him. She sat down beside him. She said she had done the math. He had gathered fragments of 7 magical dialects, the 12 harmonics of pure speech, northern throat singing, the puppet dialect, desert clicks, a lullaby from a remote village, and the overtones of kana that she'd let him memorize last week. 7 out of the estimated 20 or 30 existing schools. Less than a third. Ian nodded. Then he said there was one more school that he didn't have. The 12th harmonic. Silence. Anti-sound. The school of the silent one. And without it, the world's score would be incomplete. Like a mix from which the bass has been cut. Everything sounds right, but the foundation is missing. Sora asked how he planned to capture the sound of someone who makes no sound. Ian paused. Then he said he didn't know yet, but that somewhere in this world there were recordings. Crystals containing old voices. The Silent One was once the greatest singer on the continent. His voice had been recorded for decades. Those recordings exist somewhere, and if Ian finds them, he'll be able to hear what the Silent One was like before he became silence. Sora was silent for a moment. Then she said she knew where to look. In Venrate, in the Academy's vault, deep underground, the Sound Crystal Archive. Thousands of recordings spanning 300 years. If the Silent One's voice has been preserved anywhere, it's only there. Ian looked at her, then he looked up at the stars. Then he said that meant they'd be returning to Venrith, to where Anselm Varro was, to where the guild was, to where it was most dangerous. Sora nodded and adjusted her glasses. She said she'd always wanted to return to the academy. She just hadn't thought she'd return as a thief. Ian created a sound portrait of Mei-Rin's mother using a doll, which became a turning point in understanding his gift not as a tool for copying, but for restoration. Rumors of a wandering musician were spreading, and the Silent One intensified his attacks, robbing 3 more villages of their hearing. Ian and Sora decided to return to Venrith to search the Academy's archives for sound crystals containing the Silent One's voice from before he lost it. The journey back to Venrith took 12 days. The ensemble did not take the main road but followed small paths through villages and forests. Ian didn't want to attract attention, but attention had already been drawn to them. On the 3rd day of their journey, Nia said they were being followed. 2 people. They were keeping a distance of half a mile. They moved when they moved. They stopped when they stopped. Professionals. Nia could tell by the sound of their footsteps. A steady rhythm. No unnecessary movements. No talking. Ian asked who they were. Nia clicked 3 times. She listened to the echo. She said she didn't know, but one of them had something metallic on his chest. Small. It rang with every step at the frequency of silver. A tuning fork. The guild. Ian wasn't surprised. Anselm Varro hadn't forgotten the quarter tone. They kept walking. The tail didn't get any closer. It just followed behind. Watching. Waiting. On the 5th day, the ensemble stopped in the village of Kameni Brod. A small place. A bridge over the river. A tavern. A blacksmith shop. Ian decided to give a concert. A regular one. Without magic. Just music. To earn money for food and cement their legend. That evening, he played in the town square. Mei-Rin worked with the puppets. Sora kept the beat. Hana sat off to the side and listened. Nia stood on the roof of a neighboring house and kept watch over the approaches. Everything was as usual, until the last number. Ian was playing the final melody, a simple folk song, and suddenly he heard something new. A voice from the crowd. Old. Hoarse. A woman's voice, singing along with him. Not the melody he was playing, a different one. Over his melody. A counterpoint. A second voice that ran its own line parallel to his, and the 2 lines wove together into something third. Ian looked up. An old woman stood in the crowd. Short, thin, gray hair down to her waist. A black cloak. She was singing softly. So softly that no one around her could hear. But Ian heard every note. And the notes were impossible. She was singing in a dialect he'd never encountered before. Soft, gliding vowels. each note flowed seamlessly into the next, without boundaries. Like moonlight on water, without angles, no edges, a pure flow. A lunar dialect. Ian nearly lost his way. His fingers wavered on the fingerboard. He held onto the melody and played it through to the end. The crowd applauded. The old woman turned and walked away. Ian handed the lute to Sora and followed her. He found her beyond the village, on a hill by an old oak tree. She was sitting on a root, watching the sunset. Ian stopped 5 steps away. He said he'd heard her singing, that it was a lunar dialect, that this dialect had been considered dead for 200 years. The old woman looked at him. Her eyes were dark and deep, like a well into which a stone had been thrown and the bottom could not be heard. She said that he heard more than he should. Then she asked who he was. Ian told the truth, not all of it, but more than he'd ever told anyone except Sora. He said he could understand every dialect on the first try, that he could reproduce them on the lute, that he was compiling the world's musical score. The old woman was silent for a long time. The wind ruffled her hair. The oak hummed a low note. Then she said her name was Evelyn Court, that she was the last speaker of the lunar dialect, that this dialect had been destroyed 200 years ago along with the people who spoke it. Her grandmother had survived. She passed the dialect on to her daughter. Her daughter passed it on to Evelyn. And that's where the chain ends. Because the lunar dialect kills whoever sings in it. Every sound destroys the larynx. Slowly, irreversibly. Her grandmother died of throat cancer at 40. Her mother at 35. Evelyn is 54. She outlived them both only because she sang rarely, once a year, at sunset, a single melody. And each time, her voice grew a little worse. Ian listened, and something inside him tightened. A language that kills its speaker, like a virus that lives only as long as its host is alive, and kills the host to spread. Only there's nowhere to spread. The last host, the last voice. He asked why the dialect destroys the larynx. Evelyn explained. The lunar dialect uses frequencies that are on the edge of ultrasound, too high for normal vocal cords. To produce these sounds, the vocal cords work at their limit, micro tears with every sound, scarring, loss of elasticity, cancer. Ian thought for a moment. Then he said one sentence. He said that the lunar dialect didn't need to be sung with the voice. Evelyn froze. Ian said he could transpose it to the strings, just as he had transposed northern throat singing, just as he'd adapted the desert clicks. A lute has no larynx. A lute doesn't get sick. The strings can withstand ultrasound if you know how to tune them. Evelyn doesn't need to sing. She just needs to articulate the phonemes, quietly, one at a time, in a whisper. And he'll record them in his memory and translate them onto the instrument. The language will live on, but it won't kill her. Evelyn looked at him. Then she raised her hand and placed it on his shoulder. Her hand was light and dry as an autumn leaf. She didn't say anything. She just kept her hand on his shoulder and watched the sunset. A minute later, she took her hand away and said she'd go with him. Not forever, just until she'd passed on all the phonemes. Then she'd go back to the mountains. Ian nodded. The ensemble grew to 6, a lute, a drum, 3 puppets, a knife, a notebook, the whisper of a girl who had forgotten how to trust, and the voice of an old woman who died every time it was heard. They left Stone Ford at dawn. The guild's rearguard continued to follow behind. Ian didn't look back. He knew they were there, and he knew he'd have to deal with it soon. 3 days later, they entered the outskirts of Venreath. The city hadn't changed. The same white walls, the same towers, the same sound. But Ian had changed. 3 months ago, he'd come here as a vagabond with a lute. Now he was returning as a man with a score from the 7 schools in his head and 5 people behind him who depended on him. Sora didn't lead them to the musicians' quarter. She took them to another part of the city, the area of warehouses and workshops by the southern wall. It was quieter here. Fewer mages. Fewer ears. She found an abandoned luthier's workshop. The old man had died a year ago. He had no heirs. The door was locked, but Naya opened it in 20 seconds. Inside, it was dusty and smelled of wood and varnish. Workbenches, tools, unfinished lutes on the walls, and silence. A good kind of silence. The silence of work. Sora spread out the Academy's floor plan on the table. She had drawn it from memory 3 evenings in a row. The Academy. The main building. 3 floors. The library. The concert hall. And the basement. The sound crystal vault. The entrance is through the library. A staircase behind the 3rd bookshelf. An iron door. A magical lock. It opens with a voice, a specific phrase in pure speech known only to the senior guardians. Sora didn't know the phrase, but she knew something else. She knew that the lock didn't respond to words, but to frequency, to a precise combination of overtones. And if Ian could figure out that combination, the lock would open. Ian looked at the map, then at Sora, then at the others. Mei-Rin, Nia, Hana, Evelyn. They looked at him and waited.
He said they'd need 3 days. 1 day for reconnaissance, 1 for preparation, 1 for the operation.
Sora nodded and adjusted her glasses. She said there was one more problem. Anselm Varro. He's in town, and he knows Ian is coming back. Because the vault is the only place where a man with perfect pitch and too much curiosity can find what he's looking for. Reconnaissance took 2 days instead of 1. Sora went to the academy dressed as a music copyist. It was the old dress she'd worn before she was expelled. She'd kept it at the bottom of her bag all these months. She walked into the library like a former student who'd come to return a book. The librarian didn't recognize her, or pretended not to. Sora spent 4 hours inside. She counted the windows. She checked the shelves. She found the staircase. The door was in place. The lock glowed a faint blue. It was magical. Voice activated. She returned and reported her findings. The vault was guarded by a single mage, the on-duty keeper. During the day, he sat by the door and read. At night, he went to sleep. The lock was considered sufficient protection. No one could crack the voice code.
No one except the senior guardians knew the overtone combination.
Nia checked the approaches to the building. 3 entrances, the main one from the square, a side entrance from the garden, and the service entrance from the kitchen basement. The service entrance led through a narrow corridor past the storerooms straight to the library staircase. No guards, no locks. The mages didn't expect anyone to sneak in through the kitchen. The plan was simple. Night, service entrance, corridor, library, staircase, door. Ian picks the lock. They take the crystals. They leave. On paper, everything looked flawless. Ian knew it wouldn't be flawless. Day 3. Preparations. Ian sat in the workshop and listened. Not the city, not the street, the castle. Sora described the sound. A dull, low-frequency hum. Constant. Steady. Ian asked her to reproduce it. Sora hummed what she'd heard. Roughly. But enough for Ian to catch the key. D-sharp minor. A 3-note chord. The root. The 5th. The octave. A standard structure. But within the chord was a 4th note. Hidden. The one Sora had heard as a hum. An overtone between the 5th and the octave. That very quarter tone. The 13th harmonic. The very one Sora had written her dissertation on. The very one the Academy had declared non-existent. Ian smirked. The vault's lock was tuned to a frequency that, according to the Academy, didn't exist. Whoever built this vault knew the truth. He knew that the 13th harmonic was real, and he used it as a key, because no one looks for a key in what they consider to be emptiness. Ian spent the entire day trying to find the right on the lute. By evening, he was 90% sure. The remaining 10% was a risk. If he made a mistake, the lock might set off an alarm, Or worse, magical locks could be traps. Night. A full moon. The city wasn't entirely asleep. Venrate never slept completely. But the academy quarter grew quiet by midnight. Students headed back to their dorms. Professors went home. Guards stood at the main entrance, yawning. The ensemble emerged from the workshop. Ian with his lute, Nia with a knife, Sora with a plan in her head. Mei-Rin stayed in the workshop, Hannah too, Evelyn too. The three went inside. The three waited. If anything went wrong, Mei-Rin would take the dolls and lead Hannah and Evelyn out of the city. The meeting point was at Stone Ford. In 3 days. Nia opened the service entrance in 15 seconds. A simple bolt. The hallway was dark and smelled of boiled cabbage. They walked past the storerooms, past the kitchen, up a narrow staircase, the library. A huge hall. Thousands of books, thousands of scrolls, thousands of sheet music scores. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows and fell in streaks across the stone floor. The third bookshelf. Sora pointed. Behind it was a niche. In the niche, a staircase leading down. An iron door. A lock. A dim blue light. Ian approached. He placed his palm on the door. He felt a vibration. The lock hummed. D-sharp minor. 4 notes, 3 distinct ones, 1 hidden. He took out his lute. He tuned the first string, C-sharp. The second, G-sharp. A 5th. The third, C-sharp an octave higher. The 4th. There it was, the 13th harmonic, a note between notes, a frequency that doesn't exist. He strummed all 4 strings simultaneously with his pick. A chord. Clear. Precise. The 4 notes merged into a single vibration. The lock flickered. The blue light turned white. Then it went out. The door clicked. It opened a centimeter. Sora exhaled. Ian pushed the door open. The vault. A long hall with a low ceiling. Walls lined with niches. A crystal in each niche. Hundreds of crystals. Thousands. They glowed dimly. Each one held a voice. Someone's voice. Someone's life. Someone's magic. Recorded, preserved. Stolen or given as a gift. The Pure Word Guild's repository. 300 years of voices. Ian walked along the wall and listened. Each crystal hummed at its own frequency. Quietly. Like a distant memory. He was searching for one specific voice. The voice of the continent's greatest singer. The voice of Kalen Orr. The voice of the Silent One. Sora walked beside him, reading the inscriptions on the niches. Names, dates, schools. They were sorted by decade. She found the right row. 20 years ago. The 8th niche on the left. The crystal was larger than the others. About the size of a fist. Dark blue. And it wasn't humming. It was silent. Ian took it in his hands. Cold, heavy, dead to the touch. But when he held the crystal to his ear, he heard it. Deep inside, at a frequency below the range of normal human hearing. A voice. A man's. Low. A baritone verging on bass. A timbre of incredible beauty. Clear, as cold as a mountain stream. As deep as a gorge. A voice that made the air tremble. Kalen Orr. 20 years ago, before his vocal cords were cut out. Before he became silence. Ian stood in the vault, listening to the voice of a man whom the world had broken. And for the first time in this world, he felt something other than professional interest. Not the curiosity of a sound engineer. He felt anger. That voice had been perfect, and someone had destroyed it. He put the crystal in his bag, turned toward the exit, and froze. A man was standing in the doorway, tall, thin, dark eyes, a silver tuning fork with 3 prongs on his collar. Anselm Varro. He didn't look surprised. He looked as if he'd been waiting right here on this very night. He said calmly that he had heard the chord with which Ian had opened the door. All 4 notes. including the 13th harmonic, which, according to the Academy, does not exist. He paused. Then he said that for 20 years he had taught students that the 13th harmonic did not exist. And for 20 years he had known he was lying, because the vault's lock was tuned specifically to it. And that meant the Academy's founders knew the truth. They knew it and hid it, just as they'd hidden everything else. Ian didn't move. Sora held her breath. Nia stood in the shadows by the wall, a knife in her hand. Anselm looked at her, then back at Ian. He said he hadn't come to arrest them. He'd come to listen. Because in 3 days, the Night of Voices would take place in the capital. The annual concert at the Capitol Opera. All the schools, all the orders, all the masters. And Anselm wanted Ian to perform. Not as a vagabond, not as a thief, as who he really is. Ian asked why. Anselm replied briefly, because the world is falling silent. The silent one is coming. And the only person who can change anything is standing right in front of him in the basement, holding a crystal containing the voice of a man the guild destroyed. Anselm said he knew the story of Kalen Orr. He knew that the guild had taken his voice away. He knew that pure speech was built on stolen dialects. He knew everything. And he remained silent for 20 years. Because he believed the system could be fixed from within. But the system wasn't fixed. It was rotting. And now, silence is falling. He looked Ian in the eyes and said he was asking him, not ordering him, asking him, to perform at the opera, to show the world the truth. Ian stood there, holding the crystal containing the Silent One's voice. 3 days, the Capitol Opera, all the schools, all the orders. The ears of the entire world gathered in a single hall. He looked at Sora. She nodded. He looked at Nia. She put away the knife. Ian said yes. 3 days until the concert. The ensemble moved from the luthier's workshop to the guest rooms at the opera. Anselm had arranged it. He gave them passes. He gave them access to the rehearsal hall. He provided protection from the guild during preparations. Ian didn't trust him, but there was no choice. Day 1, rehearsal. The Capitol Opera Hall. Huge, 2,000 seats. The ceiling soared 20 meters high. The walls were clad in a specific type of stone. Ian stepped onto the stage and tapped his heel. The sound traveled upward and returned a second and a half later. Clear, undistorted. This hall was an instrument. Every stone had been carefully selected. Every angle had been calculated. The acoustics were flawless. Any sound from the stage reached the very back row without any loss of quality. Ian stood on the stage and, for the first time in this world, felt at home. Not like in Boston, like in a studio, like behind the mixing console. Only now the hall was the console and his ears were the mixer. He gathered the ensemble on stage and began setting up the arrangement. Mei-Rin on the left, the dolls in front of her on a small table. Sora on the right with a drum. Nia behind Ian, no instrument. Her instrument was her voice and the clicks. Hannah. Ian looked at her. She was standing at the edge of the stage, gazing into the empty auditorium. 2,000 empty seats. She looked paler than usual. Ian walked over to her. He didn't ask if she was ready. He didn't ask if she was going to sing. He said there was a seat in the third row on the right in the auditorium. Excellent acoustics. If she wanted, she could just sit there and listen. Hannah was silent. Then she said she'd think about it. Evelyn was sitting in a box on the second tier. She wasn't performing. She couldn't sing without harming herself. But she would whisper. The lunar dialect. The phonemes she'd been conveying to Ian, one a day, for the past 2 weeks. She would whisper, and Ian would pick up the whisper from her lips through the hall's resonance and translate it onto the strings. For that, one more detail was needed. Lyrian. Ian hadn't forgotten about her. Sora had told him about the daughter of the noble Wayne family. Deaf from birth, hidden away by her family, living in Venray. He needed her, not out of pity, for understanding. The Silent One worked his magic without sound. Lyrian lived without sound. She might know things that no one else knew. On the second day, Sora found the Wayne family's home, a large mansion in an aristocratic neighborhood. The gates were closed. Guards were on duty. Sora managed to pass a note through a maid. 3 hours later, a young woman emerged from a side door. She was short and slender. Her dark hair was tucked under a hat. She was dressed simply for an aristocrat. She was wearing gloves. She approached Sora and held out a piece of paper. Written on it in beautiful handwriting was that she had read the note, that she was interested, that her family must not know, and that she had 2 hours. Sora led her to the opera house. Lyrian entered the hall and stopped. She took off her shoes. She stood barefoot on the stone floor of the stage. She closed her eyes. Ian plucked a string on his lute, a single note, up to the 3rd octave. The sound traveled through the hall and returned. Lyrian opened her eyes. She felt it, through the floor, through the stone, through the bones of her feet. The vibration reached her like a wave across water. She looked at Ian and smiled, for the first time. Then she took out a piece of paper and wrote down what she felt in the note. Warm, round. She described the sound through touch, like a texture, like a temperature. Ian played note after note. Lyrian described each one. Do is warmth. Re is pressure. Mi is softness. Fa is sharpness. She felt the music with her skin, and her descriptions were more precise than those of most people who could hear. Ian realized why he needed her. Not for a concert, for the silent one. Kalen Orr worked his magic through the vibration of bones, without sound, through the body, exactly the way Lyrian felt the world. She was a translator, between the world of sound and the world of silence. He asked her in a note if she would stay. Lyrian wrote that she would stay, that for the first time in her life, someone wanted her to be herself, not a corrected version of herself. The second day continued with rehearsals. Ian was putting together the program. Not just a collection of melodies, one thing, a mixed score, 7 schools, 7 voices, 1 piece of music. He started with something simple, a folk melody, pure speech, 12 basic harmonics as taught at the academy. Then he gradually wove in other elements, northern overtones, the puppet dialect, desert clicks, choral technique, a lunar whisper. And every time a new voice entered the mix, the listener was meant to hear that this voice had always been there, that it had simply been cut out, stripped away, stolen. That pure speech was not the original, but a castrated version of something greater. Day 3, morning, 6 hours until the concert. Ian sat alone on stage, the lute on his lap, the crystal containing Kalen Orr's voice in his hands. He listened to the dead mage's voice over and over. He broke it down into layers. He memorized every overtone, every pause, every microtone. That voice was perfection, pure speech in its true form, not stolen, not compiled, alive. And in that voice, Ian heard something he hadn't heard before. The 13th harmonic. Kalen Orr had mastered it, freely, naturally. It was part of his voice, the frequency between notes that the Academy had declared non-existent because it was afraid. Because the 13th harmonic was the key to everything, to the vault, to the truth, to the real magic that existed before it was cut into 12 safe pieces. Ian put the crystal away. He stood up. He picked up his lute. Tonight he would play it all. All 7 schools. All 13 harmonics, the whole truth, and the world would hear it. The hall was full, 2,000 people, mages from all the schools, masters of pure speech in blue robes, northerners in furs, a delegation of desert dwellers in white shawls, even 2 choristers from the 7 throats in the far corner. The royal court occupied the central box. Anselm Varro sat in the front row. His face was calm. His hands rested on his knees. He knew what was about to happen. Ian stood backstage and listened to the hall. 2,000 breaths. 2,000 heartbeats. Every person in the hall was a note, and together they created a chord of anticipation. Sora stood nearby.
She held a drum, and her hands did not tremble. Mei-Rin sat on the floor, arranging the dolls. 3 figures, 3 voices. Nia stood against the wall with her arms crossed, a knife at her belt. Not for fighting, for confidence. Hannah stood in the shadows. She'd come backstage an hour ago. Ian didn't ask why. He just nodded at her. She nodded back. Evelyn sat in a box on the second tier, a black cloak, gray hair, eyes closed. She was waiting. Lyrian stood barefoot backstage on the opposite side of the stage. Beneath her feet was a wooden platform. Ian had spent 2 days building it. Thin planks, strings stretched between them, a resonant floor. Every note from the stage passed through the platform, and Lyrian felt it with her feet. It was her instrument, her way of hearing. The ensemble was announced. Street musicians. No one in the hall expected anything from them. A filler act before the academic choir's performance. 3 minutes on the program, maybe 5. Ian stepped onto the stage. He bowed, sat down on a chair, placed the lute on his lap. The hall was noisy. Conversations, laughter, the rustling of clothes. Ian waited. He ran his finger along the first string. 1 note. C, 3rd octave, the first harmonic of pure speech. The hall fell silent, not because the note was loud, because it was perfect, purer than that of any academic mage, purer than the hall itself. Ian added a 2nd note, F sharp, the 2nd harmonic. A chill. The 2 sounds intertwined. The 3rd, 4th, 5th. He was building pure speech, note by note, all 12 harmonics. The hall listened. The magicians in the front rows leaned forward. They heard what they heard every day, the canonical palette, but played on a lute, not sung, played. No one had ever done this before, but so far it was simply beautiful, not dangerous. Then Ian changed the pattern, the 12th note. Silence. A pause instead of a sound, but not an empty pause. A pause in which the absence of sound had its own note. Anti-sound. Several mages in the hall sensed something. They stirred. But Ian was already moving on. He added a 13th harmonic, a note between the notes, a frequency that didn't exist. The hall shuddered. Not metaphorically, physically. The stones in the walls resonated. The ceiling hummed. The air grew denser. 2,000 people simultaneously sensed that something had appeared in the music that shouldn't be there. Something forgotten. Anselm Varro, in the front row, closed his eyes. Now. Sora struck the drum. Rhythm. Simple. Steady. 2 beats per second. The foundation. Mei-Rin began to sing. The puppet dialect. 3 layers. The fundamental tone. Emotion. Deep infrasound. The puppets on the table came to life. They stood up. They turned toward the auditorium. The audience in the front rows gasped. This was not pure speech. It was another language, an ancient one, a dead one, and it was being spoken on the stage of the Capitol Opera for the first time in 200 years. Nia began. Clicks, a desolate rhythm, probing pulses directed into the auditorium. Each click found a stone in the wall and made it resonate. The walls began to sing. The auditorium became an instrument. A whisper drifted from a box on the second tier. Evelyn, the lunar dialect. Gliding vowels on the edge of ultrasound. No one in the hall heard her voice, but Ian did. He caught the phonemes from her lips through the resonance of the ceiling and translated them onto the lute. The 4th string rang out at the frequency of moonlight, softly, iridescently, like silver. The hall fell silent. It was impossible. 4 schools at once? 4 dialects in a single melody? Pure speech, puppet, desert, lunar. 4 languages that had been enemies, 4 traditions that hated one another, and they sounded like a single piece of music, because they were one piece of music, always, from the very beginning. Someone in the hall stood up, an old mage in a blue robe. His face was white. He was staring at the stage, and his lips were trembling. He heard it. He recognized it. In the canonical fire spell he had been reciting for 30 years, he discerned for the first time a fragment of the puppet dialect. Stolen, woven in, hidden. He stood there, unable to sit back down because his legs wouldn't obey him. Ian was building it up. The 5th voice, a northern throat overtone. He played it on the lute, and the lute growled like Thorvald's throat. The 6th voice, a coastal dialect, long floating vowels. He'd picked them up from the merchants at the tavern 2 months ago. 7 voices, 7 schools, 1 score. The lute in Ian's hands sounded like an orchestra, not because he was playing loudly, because every note was precise to a quarter tone, because every overtone was in its place, because he was a sound engineer and this was his best mix. The audience didn't applaud. The audience was silent. 2,000 people listened as the world they knew crumbled note by note, because every note spoke the truth. Pure speech was theft. Every spell was built upon someone's grave, and now those graves were singing. Anselm Varro stood up. He stepped onto the stage. 2,000 pairs of eyes were fixed on him. The inquisitor of the Pure Speech Guild, a model baritone. He stood opposite Ian. He opened his mouth, and he began to sing. The canonical aria of pure speech, the one every academy student learned in their first year. Anselm's voice filled the hall, powerful, clear, perfect. 20 years of perfection. Ian didn't stop. He accompanied him. The lute picked up Anselm's voice and began to weave other voices into it, a lunar dialect, a puppet-like one, a desert one, a northern one. Every stolen note returned to its rightful place. The aria transformed. It became what it had been before it was robbed, complete, genuine, alive. Anselm sang and listened. For the first time in 20 years, he heard his own voice in the context of truth. And the voice was not his. It was someone else's, stolen, compiled from the dead dialects of dead peoples. He stopped in the middle of a note. Silence. He stood in silence. 2,000 people were watching. Then Anselm turned toward the audience, and instead of speaking, he bowed, low, to the floor, in front of everyone. The guild's inquisitor was bowing to those whom the guild had destroyed. He straightened up, turned around, and he walked off the stage. He didn't look back. The hall was silent. And then, out of that silence, a sound emerged. Not from the stage, from the walls. Behind the scenes, Lyrian stood barefoot on a resonance platform and played, not with sound, with movement, with gestures across the taut strings of the floor. The vibration traveled through the wood into the stone, and through the stone into the hall. Music without sound, the magic of a deaf girl who heard the world with her feet. And then Hannah stepped onto the stage, small, quiet, pale. She stood in the center, and 2,000 people were watching her. She opened her mouth, and she began to sing. Not with choral technique, not with 7 voices, just one, her own, the voice she used to call the cats, the one she purred over the dishes, the one she used to hum a lullaby when she thought no one was listening. A small, ordinary human voice. And that voice was beautiful. Not because of perfection, not because of power, because of truth. The entire ensemble played, all together, for the first time. The lute and the drum and the puppets and the clicks and the moonlit whisper and the vibration of the floor and the voice of the girl who was singing for herself for the first time. The world's first harmonized score. A melody in which every school sounded like a part of a single piece of music. The final note hung in the air, and as that note lingered, someone in the back rows of the hall stood up.
A figure in a gray cloak. A gray-haired man, his hood thrown back. His face was disfigured by a scar across his throat. He had no lips. His eyes were dark and empty as a well, silent. Kalen Orr. He stood motionless. 2,000 people froze. Someone in the hall cried out. Someone tried to stand up. The silent man raised his hand, not in a curse, not in an attack. Palm up, a conductor's gesture, a sign that meant one word: continue. The concert at the Capitol Opera House became a public exposé. Ian played a consolidated score from 7 schools, demonstrating that pure speech was built on stolen dialects. Anselm Varro stepped onto the stage, sang the canonical aria, and stopped midway, realizing the truth, after which he bowed and left. Hannah sang in her own voice for the first time. The silent one appeared in the auditorium and signaled to continue. The hall fell silent. 2,000 people held their breath. The silent one stood in the aisle between the rows, and his presence changed the air. Ian could feel it, not with his ears, but with his skin. The temperature around Kalen Orr was 2 degrees lower. Sounds near him grew fainter, quieter, as if the very air around him were saturated with anti-sound. People in the nearest rows covered their ears, not because of pain, because of the silence, because of the oppressive absence of sound that was worse than any roar. Ian didn't move. The lute lay on his lap, his fingers on the strings. He looked at the silent one across the entire hall and listened. Not sound. Silence. Kalen Orr's silence was not empty. It was full, like a glass filled to the brim with black water. It contained everything, every sound he had ever made, every note that had been stolen from him, every scream he hadn't been able to cry out when his throat was slit. 20 years of silence, 20 years of rage, 20 years of grief locked inside a voiceless body. Ian heard it, not with his ears, with something deeper, with that hearing he'd gained when he woke up in the ditch, the hearing of this world. And he understood. The silent one didn't take people's hearing out of hatred. He took it out of despair. If no one hears, then no one can steal. If everyone is deaf, then everyone is equal. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. Twisted, insane, but protection nonetheless. Kalen Orr wanted the world to stop stealing other people's voices, and the only way he could find was to take away the world's ability to hear. Ian stood up, the lute in his hands. He stepped down from the stage. He walked down the center aisle toward the silent one. The ensemble remained on stage: Sora, Mei-Rin, Nia, and Hannah. Behind the scenes was Lyrian. In the box was Evelyn. Everyone was watching. Everyone was silent. Ian stopped 3 steps away from Kalen. Up close, the silence was overwhelming. It pressed against his eardrums. He felt the sound around him die away. The lute in his hands fell silent. The strings lost their resonance. It was as if the air between them had turned to cotton. Ian opened his mouth and spoke a single sentence. He said he could hear his voice. The silent one didn't move. His eyes didn't change. But something in his silence flinched. A microscopic vibration. At a frequency only Ian could detect. A response. Ian took a crystal out of his bag. Dark blue, the size of a fist. He held it up so Kalen could see it. He said that within this crystal lay the voice of Kalen Orr, the man he had been 20 years ago, the greatest singer on the continent, the man who knew the truth about the pure speech and wanted to tell it, the man whose throat had been slit for it. The silent one stared at the crystal. For the first time, something changed on his face. Not his expression. Faces without lips have no expressions, but the muscles around his eyes, his forehead. Something shifted. Something cracked in the wall he had been building for 20 years. Ian said he could restore his voice. The silence tightened. The pressure mounted. People in the front rows groaned. Someone's nose began to bleed. The silent one wasn't attacking. He was reacting. His silence was an emotion: anger, pain, distrust, hope. The hope he'd stifled 20 years ago and that was now bursting out like a beast from a cage. Ian didn't back down. He raised the lute and began to play. Not his own, Kaylin's voice, the one that had been in the crystal. Ian had listened to it hundreds of times over the past 3 days. He'd broken it down into layers, memorized every overtone, every pause, every microtone, and now he was translating it onto the strings. The lute sang in the voice of Kaylin Orr. Not a copy, not an imitation, a portrait. Just as he had created a portrait of Mei-Rin's mother through a doll. A sonic portrait of a man who no longer existed. He froze in silence. His hands, which had always been still, began to tremble. He heard himself. Not what he had become, what he had been. His own voice, his own timbre, his own music. 20 years ago, when the world still had sound, when he could still sing. Ian played and felt the silence around Kaylin changing, not disappearing, changing shape. From a wall, it became a dome. From a weapon, into a refuge. Kaylin listened, and his anti-sound stopped pressing outward. It curled inward. It protected not the world from sound, but Kaylin from the world. But that wasn't enough. The portrait was only the beginning. Ian knew the portrait wouldn't restore his voice. It could show what had been, but it couldn't create what would be. For that, something else was needed, something Ian had been gathering for a whole year. He changed the melody. Kaylin's voice on the lute began to shift. A northern overtone was added to it. Torvald, Gronhamar, throat singing that moves mountains. Then the puppet dialect. Mei-Rin. 3 layers, the mother's voice, the daughter's voice, the connection between them. Then desert clicks. Nia, a probing pulse, a sound that finds what is lost. Then the lunar dialect. Evelyn. From the box upstairs, an old woman whispered phonemes, and Ian caught them through the resonance of the ceiling. Gliding vowels that heal, that restore. Then Hannah's voice, that small, genuine voice, not part of a chorus, human, a voice that belongs only to her. Then the vibration of Lyrian, from behind the scenes, through the wooden platform, through the stone of the stage, through the floor of the hall. Silent music. The magic of the body, the very same magic that the silent one possessed. 7 voices, 7 schools, and the 13th harmonic that bound them together. A note between the notes, a frequency that had always existed but had been hidden because it was the truth. Ian played and the mix took shape, layer by layer, track by track, just like in the studio on Tremont Street. Only instead of microphones, there were people. Instead of monitors, there was a hall. Instead of a client, there was a voiceless man standing 3 steps away, his whole body trembling. It was his best mix. It was his own creation, not stolen, not copied, assembled, from the voices that had been given to him, from fragments entrusted to him. Every note in this melody was given freely. Torvald gave his throat singing over a mug of beer in the tavern. Mei-Rin gave her puppet dialect in exchange for the promise of 2 meals a day. Nia gave her clicks in silence because Ian didn't ask her to repeat the beautiful sound. Hannah gave her voice because Ian asked her every single time. Evelyn gave the lunar dialect because he found a way to preserve it without killing her. Lyrian gave her silence because he didn't try to fix her. Sora gave everything because he was the first to say that her hearing wasn't a defect. Not a single note in this score was stolen. Every one was a gift, and that was the difference. Between him and those who, 200 years ago, pieced together the pure speech from corpses. Between theft and composition. Between taking someone else's voice and helping it to sound. The melody reached its climax. All 7 schools sounded at once. The hall resonated, the walls sang, the ceiling hummed. The floor vibrated beneath the feet of 2,000 people, and at the center of all that sound stood the Silent One, and his silence was changing. Ian directed the melody toward him, not as a weapon, as a remedy. Nia's probing impulse found the remnants of vocal cords in the mutilated throat. Evelyn's lunar dialect began to regenerate the tissue. Torvald's throat overtone provided resonance. Mei-Rin's puppet dialect established a connection between body and voice.
Hannah's voice provided the pattern, a model of how a person sounds when they sing to themselves. Lyrian's vibration provided a bridge between silence and sound. And the 13th harmonic bound everything into a single whole. Kalen Orr stood in the hall's passageway, and his body was changing. Not on the outside, on the inside. The throat, the vocal cords, the larynx. 20 years of scarring, 20 years of silence. And through those 20 years, slowly, like a sprout pushing through asphalt, a sound broke through. The first sound. Not a word, not a note. A rasp. Quiet. Hoarse. Barely audible. But Ian heard it. The entire hall heard it. Kalen Orr made a sound. For the first time in 20 years. The rasp became a tone. The tone became a note. The note was imperfect, shaky, weak. It was not the voice of the greatest singer. It was the voice of a man who was learning to speak all over again. But it was a voice. Kalen raised his hands to his throat. His fingers touched the scar. He opened his mouth, a mouth without lips, ugly, mutilated. And a sound emerged from that mouth, a single note. Not pure, not beautiful, real. The silence around him began to melt away. Like ice in spring, the anti-sound dissipated. The world around Kalen Orr regained its sound. The people in the front rows took their hands away from their ears. They could hear it. Kalen was singing. A single note, over and over, each time a little more confidently, a little purer, a little closer to the voice Ian had heard in the crystal. Not the same one, a different one, a new one. The voice of a man who had lost everything and found a single note. Ian lowered his lute. His hands were shaking. Blood was flowing from his nose and both ears. His head was pounding so hard he couldn't stand. He sat down right on the floor in the hall's passageway. The world was spinning. Sora was right there. She caught him, held him by the shoulders, said something. He couldn't hear the words, only the tone. Fear, concern, anger, all at once. Kalen Orr stopped singing. He stood there, looking at Ian, who was sitting on the floor in a pool of his own blood from his nose. Then he did something the Silent One had never done before. He dropped to his knees, in front of Ian. He raised his hand. He placed his palm on Ian's chest, right where his heart was, and Ian felt it. A vibration was traveling through Kalen's palm. Not sound, not anti-sound, something else entirely. The 13th harmonic. A frequency between frequencies. A note that is neither sound nor silence, but a bridge between them. Kalen was giving him strength. Not his own, a shared strength. The power of the world that resonated all around them. For 20 years, Kalen had taken sound away from the world. Now he was giving it back. Through Ian. Through the one he had called upon 20 years ago at the moment he lost his voice. Ian closed his eyes. The pain receded. The bleeding stopped. The ringing in his head subsided. He could hear again. He could hear everything. The hall. The breathing of 2,000 people. Sora's heartbeat nearby. Nia's quiet click from the stage. Hannah's purring. Evelyn's whisper. The vibration of Lyrian. Mei-Rin's lullaby. And Kalen Orr's voice. Hoarse. Weak. New. Ian opened his eyes. He looked at Kalen. Kalen was looking at him. For the first time in 20 years, there was something other than emptiness in his eyes. Not joy, not gratitude. Peace.
silence that was no longer a weapon. A week later, Anselm Vero surrendered to the capital's authorities and publicly admitted that pure speech had been built on stolen dialects. The Guild of the Pure Word was dissolved. The Choir of the Seven Throats reopened its temples. The language keepers emerged from the desert. Not immediately, not easily. The world didn't with a single concert. But the world begins to change when it hears the truth for the first time. A month later, Ian began traveling to the villages where the Silent One had taken away their hearing. Kaylin traveled with him. Together they removed the blocks. Ian played, Kaylin sang. His voice was weak, 3 notes on a good day, but those 3 notes were enough, because Ian combined them with the other 6 scales, creating a melody that opened the noise gate in the ears of the deaf. Slowly, 1 person at a time, 1 village at a time. After half a year, 200 people had regained their hearing. After a year, 1,000. Another year later, Ian opened a school. Not a school of magic, a school of listening. A small house in Stoneford, halfway between the capital and the desert. Sora kept records. Mei-Rin taught the children the puppet dialect. Nia taught them to hear the desert. Hannah taught them to sing for themselves. Lyrian taught them to hear without ears. Evelyn taught the lunar dialect, 1 phoneme a day. Not with her voice, through strings. The language lived and did not kill. Kaylin came once a week. He sat in the corner. He listened. Sometimes he sang. 1 note, then 2, then 3. His voice would never be the same again, but he didn't need it to be. He just needed to know that someone was listening. One evening, Ian was sitting on the school porch, a lute on his lap. Sora was beside him. She was writing in a notebook, a new notebook, her 18th. She looked up and asked which school he went to. Ian thought for a moment. Then he said none. He's not a mage, not a singer, not a fighter. He's a sound engineer. He takes other people's voices and makes them sound better. Sora adjusted her glasses. She said that was the school, the 9th one, the school of listening, and that she was the first to enroll in it. Ian looked at her, at the ink stains on her fingers, at the gray eyes behind the round lenses, at the woman who had been walking with him since day 1, because he was the first to tell her that her hearing wasn't a defect. He didn't say anything romantic. He picked up the lute and played a melody, the one he'd written for her long ago, back in the 3rd week after they'd met. A melody in which every one of her extra quarter tones stood at the center of the harmony, not on the edge, not in the shadows, at the center. Sora stopped writing. She set down her pen. She listened. Then she took off her glasses and wiped them with the edge of her sleeve. Her eyes were shining. She didn't say anything. She just rested her head on his shoulder. The sun was setting. Voices drifted out from the house. Mei-Rin was scolding her dolls. Nia was sharpening a knife. Hannah was singing to the cat. Evelyn was whispering phonemes. Lyrian was tapping her palm on the wooden floor, keeping the beat. Ian was listening to them all. Every note, every overtone, every pause. His ensemble, his score. Not stolen, a gift. He played the last note and lowered his lute. The world was making sound. Not perfectly, not pure, but it was making sound, and that was enough.